Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey back through time, back before Christmas, before Santa, before twinkling lights and wrapped presents. We're traveling 10,000 years into the past, to the frozen edges of the world, where darkness ruled for months and people weren't sure if the sun would ever return. Imagine standing in endless winter darkness, watching the days grow shorter and shorter, wondering, will the light ever come back? This is where our story begins, where ancient people carved their prayers into stone, where reindeer were more than animals, and where the first seeds of Christmas were planted in ice and fear and hope. So, before we step into this ancient world together, I'd love it if you could do something for me. If this story speaks to you, if you find yourself drawn into these frozen northern lands, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. And I'm curious, where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you tucked in bed? Sitting by a window? Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are and what time it is where you're listening. I love imagining all of you scattered across the globe sharing this moment with me. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and let's walk together into the longest night of the year, 10,000 winters ago. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine what it felt like to live in Northern Europe during the Ice Age. Not the Ice Age of movies and cartoons, the real one. A world where winter wasn't just a season, it was an existential threat. Around 10,000 years ago, the great ice sheets that had covered Scandinavia for millennia were finally retreating. Slowly, tentatively, life began to creep back into these harsh lands. And with life came people, the first brave souls to call this frozen wilderness home. These weren't the Vikings yet. The Viking Age was still 8,000 years away. These were the ancestors, hunters and gatherers who followed herds of reindeer northward as the ice melted, who lived in hide tents that could be packed up and moved at a moment's notice, who knew that survival meant moving with the rhythms of the animals and the sun. And oh, that sun. If you've ever experienced a northern winter, you know what I'm talking about. But 10,000 years ago, without electric lights, without candles even, without any way to push back the darkness except fire, the shortening days must have felt apocalyptic. Each day the sun rose a little later, set a little earlier. Each day the darkness grew hungrier, more oppressive. In the far north of Norway, around what we now call the Arctic Circle, there comes a point in winter where the sun doesn't rise at all. For weeks. Just endless twilight fading into endless night, fading back into twilight. Modern scientists call this polar night. Ancient people probably called it, well, we don't know what they called it, because they left no written records. But we know they noticed. We know they cared, because they carved their fear and their hope into stone. Along the western coast of Norway, archaeologists have found some of the oldest evidence of human habitation in Scandinavia, and among these ancient sites are petroglyphs, rock carvings, that date back 10,000 years. These aren't random doodles. These are prayers, messages, desperate attempts to communicate with forces beyond human understanding. And what did these ancient people carve? Reindeer, boats, and abstract symbols that some scholars believe represent the sun. Picture this, a hunter, his hands rough and scarred from cold and work, kneeling before a smooth rock face. Using a harder stone as a tool, he carefully, methodically, pecks out the shape of a reindeer, the animal that means life or death to his people. He adds a boat beneath it, because his people travel along the fjords and coastlines, navigating between fishing and hunting grounds. And then, above it all, he carves a circle, a wheel, a sun. Why? Why spend hours upon hours creating these images? because he's terrified. Because every year as winter approaches, the sun grows weaker. What if this is the year it doesn't come back? What if the darkness finally wins? This fear, this primal gut-deep terror of endless winter, is the soil from which all winter solstice celebrations grew. And here's the beautiful, heartbreaking thing. This fear was universal. All around the world, ancient people looked at the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, and thought, we need to do something. We need to help the sun come back. In Ireland, they built Newgrange, a massive stone tomb designed so perfectly that on the winter solstice morning, and only on that morning, sunlight penetrates deep into its chamber. In England, they built Stonehenge, aligned to frame the sunset on the winter solstice. In Scandinavia, they carved petroglyphs and eventually they created Yule. The word Yule itself is ancient, older than English, older than Christianity, older than written history in Northern Europe. It comes from the Old Norse word Jol, which might derive from Yule, meaning wheel. Not just any wheel, but the wheel of the year, the great cosmic wheel that turns through the seasons. And at the winter solstice, that wheel reaches its lowest, darkest point before beginning its slow ascent back toward light and warmth. Imagine that wheel as a great fiery disk rolling across the heavens. That's the sun. And in the depths of winter, that wheel dips down to its lowest point, barely skimming the horizon, threatening to roll away into the darkness forever. The winter solstice was the moment of crisis, the moment when the wheel could either continue its descent into eternal night or begin, by the grace of gods or fate or cosmic law, to climb back towards summer. Now, here's something that might surprise you. These ancient people weren't stupid. They knew intellectually that the sun would return. They'd seen it happen every year of their lives, but knowledge and feeling are different things. When you're standing in darkness at 2 p.m., when you're rationing the last of your dried fish and wondering if your stores will last until spring, when your children are hungry and the cold seeps into your very bones, intellectual knowledge doesn't cut it. You need ritual. You need ceremony. You need to do something. And so they did. We don't know exactly what the people of 10,000 years ago did at the winter solstice. They left us only their rock carvings. But we can imagine, based on what we know of later traditions, that they gathered together, that they lit fires, big ones, roaring bonfires that pushed back the darkness and mimicked the sun they were willing to return, that they told stories, passed down through generations, about the eternal battle between light and dark, life and death, warmth and cold. They probably made offerings. Maybe they left food at sacred sites, those rocks where they'd carved their petroglyphs. Maybe they sacrificed animals. Definitely they feasted, because if you're going to survive a Scandinavian winter, you need to celebrate whenever you can. You need to remind yourself and your community that life is worth fighting for, that spring will come, that the sun will return. And in all of this, reindeer played a central role. These animals weren't just food, though they were certainly that. Meat for eating, hides for clothing and shelter, antlers and bones for tools. Reindeer were partners. They were the animals who, unlike bears or wolves or other dangerous creatures, allowed humans to approach them, to follow them, eventually to live alongside them. The reindeer appeared in those ancient petroglyphs again and again because they were the embodiment of survival. They were the animals who knew how to live in winter, who knew where to dig through snow to find the lichen and moss beneath, who migrated across vast distances following instincts older than memory. To follow the reindeer was to survive. To lose the reindeer was to die. So when these ancient people gathered at the winter solstice, when they lit their fires and made their offerings and carved their prayers into stone, the reindeer were there, in the flesh, following their ancient migration routes, and in spirit, honoured as sacred creatures who bridged the gap between human and divine, between survival and death. Here's something beautiful. This wasn't just a Scandinavian phenomenon. While Norse people were worrying about the sun in the frozen north, other cultures were doing the same thing in their own ways. The Romans had Saturnalia, a week-long festival of role reversals and gift-giving that ended right at the solstice. The Persians celebrated Yalda, the longest night, by staying up until dawn to witness the sun's return. The Incans had Inti Raymi, honouring the sun god. The Chinese had Dongji, where families gathered to eat and celebrate the return of the longer days. Humanity, spread across the world, looked up at the same sun and felt the same fear and the same hope. We're all children of the light. We all need the sun to return. But in Northern Europe, something unique was brewing. The harsh conditions, the long darkness, the intimate relationship with reindeer, the meeting of different cultures, all of this would eventually create a rich mythology unlike any other. The Norse world wasn't born in a day. It grew slowly, over thousands of years, layer upon layer of belief and story and ritual. Those early hunters who carved reindeer into stone didn't know they were laying the foundation for Odin and Thor. They didn't know that thousands of years later, their winter solstice rituals would be called Yule. They didn't know that their partnership with reindeer would eventually transform into the image of Santa's sleigh pulled through the sky by flying reindeer. They just knew that the darkness was long, and they needed the light to return, and they would do whatever it took to help that happen. And here's the thing, it worked. Every year, without fail, their prayers were answered. The sun did return. The wheel of the year did turn. Spring came. Life continued. And so the rituals continued, growing more elaborate, more meaningful, passing from generation to generation until they became the bedrock of culture itself. So when you think about Christmas lights twinkling on houses, remember those first fires lit against the polar darkness. When you see reindeer decorations, remember those ancient petroglyphs carved with cold, desperate hands. When you feel that special magic of the darkest time of year, remember that you're feeling something humans have felt for 10,000 years, the relief and joy of knowing the light will return. The story we're telling tonight stretches from those first hunter-gatherers all the way to your living room, from ancient stone carvings to Christmas trees. And we're just getting started. We've met the first humans in the frozen north. We've stood with them through the longest night. We've felt their fear and their hope. But we haven't yet met the people who would forge the deepest connection with the reindeer. A people so attuned to these animals that their language had hundreds of words to describe them. A people whose very existence was intertwined with the herds. We're about to meet the Sami, the true people of the reindeer, the wizards of the north, the ones who would become legends in Viking sagas. But that's a story that deserves its own telling, its own moment in the warmth and darkness we've created here together. Now let me tell you about a people who took that relationship with reindeer further than anyone else in human history. A people whose entire existence for thousands of years has been woven together with these animals in a dance of survival so intricate, so beautiful, that even today, scientists and linguists marvel at it. Somewhere around the same time those ancient hunters were carving petroglyphs on Norwegian rocks, something fascinating was happening far to the east, in the region we now call the Ural Mountains. A group of people, speaking a language completely different from what would become Norse, began a slow migration westward. These were the ancestors of the Sami people, and their journey would take them across thousands of miles, over thousands of years, until they reached the northernmost edges of Europe. Here's what's wild. The Sami aren't related to their Scandinavian neighbours at all. While the Norse were part of the Germanic language family, cousins to English, German, Dutch, the Sami spoke a Uralic language, making them linguistic relatives of, wait for it, Hungarians and Estonians. How's that for a plot twist? Imagine, the indigenous people of Norway's frozen north are more closely related linguistically to people living in Central Europe than they are to the Vikings they would eventually live alongside, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to that migration, back to around 8000 BCE, when the Sami ancestors first began following the reindeer herds into what would become their homeland, a vast territory they call Sapmi, stretching across what we now know as northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Kola Peninsula of Russia. Now, I want you to imagine something for me. Can you picture following a herd of wild animals for your entire life? Not just hunting them occasionally, but organizing your whole existence around their movements, knowing that when the reindeer move to higher ground in summer, you move too. When they migrate to the coast in winter, you follow. Your entire calendar, your entire sense of place and purpose, determined by animals that don't even know you're following them. This was the Sami way of life, and over thousands of years something remarkable happened. They didn't just follow reindeer, they began to understand them on a level that seems almost supernatural. They learned to read the behavior of a herd the way you or I might read a book. They could predict where the reindeer would go next, what they would do in different weather, how they would react to predators or obstacles. And this understanding went so deep that it transformed their very language. Here's something that will blow your mind. The Sami language contains such a rich, nuanced vocabulary for describing reindeer that a skilled herder could identify a single specific animal out of a herd of several thousand just by speaking its description. Not a name, a description. The pattern of its fur, the exact curve of its antlers, its age, its sex, its temperament, the way it walks, all of this encoded in precise linguistic terms that exist nowhere else on Earth. Think about that for a second. We think we're pretty clever with our smartphones and our databases, right? The Sami created a biological database in their language, an oral tradition so precise that it functioned like a modern inventory system, except it was carried in human memory and passed down through generations. You know what? Let me ask you something. What's the most specialized vocabulary you know? Maybe you're into wine, and you can talk about notes and tannins and terroir. Maybe you're a gamer, and you know all the technical terms for different strategies and moves. Maybe you're a parent, and you've learned a whole new language of different types of cries and what they mean. Whatever it is, multiply that by about 100, and you're starting to approach the level of specialized knowledge the Sami had about reindeer. But it wasn't just academic knowledge. This was survival. Because here's the thing about the Arctic. It's not just cold, it's a place where one mistake can kill you, where losing track of the herd could mean starvation, where not understanding the weather patterns could leave you trapped in a blizzard. The Sami didn't have the luxury of being wrong. Their knowledge had to be perfect, or they wouldn't survive to pass it on. So how did they hunt these animals they understood so well? With incredible ingenuity, that's how. One of the most fascinating archaeological discoveries in Sami territories are these things called Siedi stones. Picture this. Large stones, roughly human-shaped, standing between 2 and 5 feet tall, positioned strategically in mountain passes and along reindeer migration routes. At first, archaeologists were confused. Were these religious markers? territorial boundaries. Then someone figured it out. They were scarecrows, but not for birds, for reindeer. The Sami would set up these human-shaped stones to funnel reindeer herds toward pitfalls and traps. The reindeer, seeing what looked like human silhouettes in the distance, would naturally veer away, right into the areas where hunters were waiting. Near these stones, archaeologists have found shooting shelters, carefully constructed hiding places made from smaller stones and animal hides, where Sami hunters would crouch, sometimes for hours, waiting for the perfect moment. And around these sites, thousands of reindeer bones, evidence of successful hunts going back thousands of years. Can you imagine the patience required? Sitting absolutely still in sub-zero temperatures, wind cutting through your furs, waiting for a herd to move into position. This wasn't sport hunting. This was survival hunting, where missing a shot could mean your family goes hungry, where success meant life and death. But here's what I love about the Sami. They weren't just brilliant hunters and trackers. They created a society that was, in many ways, more progressive than the civilized cultures that would eventually try to conquer them. The Sami organized themselves into family groups called Sidas, and these weren't patriarchal tribes led by warrior chiefs. Nope. The Sida was led by the oldest person in the group, regardless of gender. Let me say that again, because it's important. The leader was chosen based on wisdom and experience, not on being male or being the strongest fighter. If the oldest member of your Sida was a grandmother, she was in charge. She decided where and when the group would move, who would fish where, who would hunt where, how resources would be distributed. She mediated disputes and represented the group in meetings with other Sidas. This was radical. While the rest of Europe was developing rigid hierarchies based on military power and inherited nobility, the Sami were practicing a form of gerontocratic democracy, where experience and wisdom mattered more than anything else. Kind of makes you wonder who the civilized ones really were, doesn't it? Some Sidas were nomadic, moving constantly with the reindeer. Others were semi-nomadic, returning to the same settlements seasonally. And some lived in permanent communities, relying more on fishing than reindeer hunting. But all of them maintained that core organizational principle: respect for elders, communal decision-making, and an intimate relationship with the land and animals. Now let's talk about what they left behind, because this is where things get really fascinating and a little bit eerie. Archaeologists working in Sami territories have discovered some unusual burials that tell us a lot about their beliefs and practices. One of the most distinctive features is their treatment of the dead, bodies wrapped carefully in birch bark shrouds before being laid to rest. Birch bark, that waterproof, preservative material that was so valuable in the north, used to honor the deceased. But even more interesting are the bear burials. The Sami hunted bears, dangerous, difficult prey that required incredible courage. And when they killed a bear, they didn't just butcher it and move on. They performed elaborate rituals, carefully arranging the bear's bones in specific patterns, treating the animal with a reverence that suggests deep spiritual beliefs. There's a later Sami poem that hints at why. Eating certain parts of a bear was believed to grant you the animal's strength. Sound familiar? The Vikings had a similar belief with their berserker warriors, but the Sami version was older, more ritualistic, more deeply embedded in their spiritual worldview. They believed everything had a soul. Animals, rocks, trees, lakes. This wasn't just poetry. This was how they understood reality. Imagine living in a world where everything around you is alive, conscious, deserving of respect, where the lake you fish from isn't just water and fish, but a being with its own spirit that you need to honor, where the mountain you cross isn't just rock, but a presence that watches you pass. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was a profound philosophical framework that created sustainable relationships with the environment. The Sami lived this way for thousands of years, successfully, sustainably, while empires rose and fell to the south, while cities were built and burned. The Sami followed the reindeer, spoke their incredibly precise language, organized themselves democratically, and maintained their spiritual connection to the land. They had no writing system, so they couldn't leave us books or documents. But they left us something more durable, archaeological evidence of a way of life that worked, that sustained people through unimaginable hardship, that created meaning and community in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And here's the beautiful, poignant thing. Their way of life was so effective, so well adapted to their environment, that it remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. While the rest of Europe went through the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Roman Empire, the Dark Ages, the Sami just kept being Sami. Not because they were isolated or primitive, but because they'd figured out something that worked. Of course, that couldn't last forever, because eventually, around the 8th and 9th centuries, another group of people began expanding northward. People who built longships and wore iron armor. People who worshipped gods like Odin and Thor. People who would look at the Sami with a mixture of awe, fear, and greed. People we now call Vikings. And when these two cultures met, the Norse warriors and sailors from the south, and the Sami reindeer people from the north, something fascinating happened. Something that would shape both cultures in ways neither could predict, and that would eventually contribute to the legends and traditions we now associate with Christmas. But that encounter, that collision of worlds, that's a story that needs space to breathe. Picture this moment. It's around the year 98 AD, and in Rome, a historian named Tacitus is writing about the far edges of the known world. He's never been to the frozen north himself. Honestly, why would he? Rome was warm and civilized and had functioning plumbing. But he's talking to traders, soldiers, people who venture to the mysterious lands beyond Germania. And he writes about a people he calls the Feni, hunters who live in the far north, who wear animal skins, who travel on skis, and who follow reindeer. This is the first time the Sami appear in written history. Not by their own hand. Remember, they had no writing system, but through the eyes of a Roman trying to make sense of people whose lifestyle was so foreign, it might as well have been from another planet. The name Feni is fascinating. It probably comes from a Proto-Germanic word meaning to find, because the Sami were finders, people who found their food by hunting and gathering rather than farming. To the Romans and early Germanic tribes, this was exotic, almost magical. While everyone else was tied to their fields and their herds of domestic animals, the Sami just found what they needed. They moved like ghosts through territories no one else could survive in. Over the next few centuries, other writers would mention these mysterious northern people. In the 2nd century, Ptolemy of Alexandria called them the Finoi. In 555 AD, the Greek author Procopius referred to Scrid Finns, and here's where it gets interesting, people who kept deer. Not wild deer they hunted, but deer they kept. This might be the first historical reference to the Sami beginning to domesticate reindeer, a process that would transform their entire way of life. By 750 AD, another writer, Paulus Diaconus, observed these Scrid Finns more specifically, noting how they used their deer for transportation and probably food. Can you imagine being one of these early chroniclers, hearing stories about people who could ski faster than you could run, who could train deer to pull sleds, who could survive in conditions that would kill you in hours? It must have seemed like fantasy. But here's what I love. While these foreign writers were treating the Sami like exotic curiosities, the Sami were just living, doing what they'd always done, following the reindeer, raising their families, practicing their beliefs. They didn't need validation from Roman historians or Greek geographers. They were too busy surviving and thriving in the Arctic. Then, around the 8th and 9th centuries, something significant happened. The Norse people, the ones we often call Vikings, though that term is a bit more specific than that, began expanding their territory northward. They'd mastered sailing, built incredible ships, and were looking for new resources, new trade routes, new opportunities. Now here's something important to understand. When we say Vikings, we often picture raiders and warriors, right? Horned helmets, berserkers, all that stuff. But most Norse people were actually farmers, fishermen, and traders. The raiding was more of a side gig, and as they pushed north along the Norwegian coast, they weren't necessarily looking for people to conquer. They were looking for resources, and they found the Sami. Imagine you're a Norse settler establishing a fishing village along a fjord. The winters here are brutal, even by Scandinavian standards. Your farming is marginal at best. But you hear stories about people living further inland who have access to furs. Not just any furs, but Arctic fox, ermine, otter, marten, bear. Luxury goods that southern traders will pay fortunes for. You hear about these people who can ski through conditions that would strand you, who can track animals you can't even see, who know this harsh land in ways you never will. What do? If you're smart, you trade with them, and that's exactly what happened. The relationship between the Norse and the Sami was complex, not simply one of conquest, though there was certainly a power imbalance, but a genuine interdependence that would last for centuries. One of the most detailed accounts of this relationship comes from around the year 890, and it's absolutely fascinating. A wealthy Norse chieftain named Othere, or Otter in Norwegian, made a long journey from his home in northern Norway all the way to England, to the court of King Alfred the Great. And Alfred, being curious and educated, asked Othere to describe his homeland. What Othere told him was written down, and miraculously, it survived. This document is one of the most valuable sources we have about early Norse-Sami relations. And here's what Othere said. He lived in the northernmost settlement of the Norse people, beyond which only the Sami lived. His wealth came primarily from tribute he received from the Sami, specifically furs and skins. He listed them: otter, marten, bear, and reindeer. Now, the word Othere used for this tribute was gaffel, and this is where things get really interesting. Because gaffol doesn't just mean tax or payment. The deeper meaning of the Old Norse word gofga is much richer. To give, to sacrifice, to honour. Think about what that means. This wasn't just an economic transaction, like you paying your taxes or your rent. This was a reciprocal relationship built on mutual respect and obligation. The Sami gave these valuable furs to Othere, and in return, Othere provided protection, probably helped with disputes, facilitated trade with southern markets. It was closer to the feudal relationship between a lord and his vassals, except in this case, the vassals could leave any time they wanted because, well, try chasing someone on skis through the Arctic wilderness. This system tells us something important. The Norse didn't simply conquer the Sami. They couldn't. The Sami controlled the interior lands. They knew the terrain. They had survival skills the Norse couldn't match. Any Norse person who tried to push into Sami territory without permission wouldn't last long. So instead, both groups found a way to coexist, each providing what the other needed. Here's something that might surprise you. the Norse and Sami didn't live in completely separate worlds. There was general geographical pattern. Norse settlements concentrated along the coast and fjords, Sami territories more inland and in the mountains, but there was also significant overlap, especially in Norway. And where there's overlap, there's, well, romance. DNA analysis of graves from the Viking Age shows clear evidence of intermarriage between Norse and Sami populations. Makes sense, right? If you're a young Norse person in a small coastal village and you meet a Sami person who's visiting to trade, who's exotic and skilled and probably pretty attractive, nature takes its course. These weren't forbidden relationships or scandalous affairs. They were just people being people, finding connection across cultural boundaries. Some Norse people married into Sami Cedas. Some Sami people settled in Norse communities. Children grew up bilingual, belonging to both worlds. But, and this is a big but, the political situation made everything complicated. Because here's something that blows my mind. The Sami were being taxed by 3 different kingdoms simultaneously. Let me say that again. 3 kingdoms. Norway from the west, Sweden from the south, and Russia from the east all claimed the right to collect tribute from the Sami. Imagine trying to make a living in the harsh Arctic, and you've got 3 different groups showing up demanding furs, demanding reindeer meat, demanding acknowledgement of their authority. Have you ever had to deal with bureaucracy from multiple sources? Maybe you've had to file taxes in 2 different states, or deal with competing insurance companies after an accident. Now multiply that frustration by about 1,000, and you're starting to understand what the Sami dealt with. Swedish tax collectors would venture up from the south, Russian collectors would come from the east, Norwegian collectors from the west, and the Sami, caught in the middle, had to navigate this impossible situation while still trying to survive, still following their reindeer, still maintaining their way of life. This pressure had consequences. The Norse sagas mention that the Sami were exceptional hunters, partly out of necessity. They needed to hunt more intensively to meet these tribute demands. One saga character says admiringly, "They can follow tracks like gods both on thawed ground and on hard frozen snow, and they are so able on skis that nothing can escape them, neither men nor animals, and whatever they shoot at they hit." That's not exaggeration. That's recognition of genuine skill born from absolute necessity. When your survival depends on successful hunts, and you're also trying to meet tribute obligations to 3 different kingdoms, you get really, really good at hunting. The multiple taxation also affected reindeer populations. Around the year 1500, historical records show that wild reindeer numbers started to decline significantly. The Sami were being pushed to hunt more than was sustainable, and this crisis led to a major transformation. Instead of just hunting wild reindeer, more Sami began actively domesticating and herding them. This wasn't a simple switch. It fundamentally changed their relationship with the animals. Instead of following wild herds, they were now managing semi-domestic ones. Instead of being purely nomadic hunters, they became semi-nomadic pastoralists. Their entire cultural identity shifted, though slowly, over generations. But through all of this, the political pressure, the cultural changes, the economic stress, the Sami maintained something the Norse found both fascinating and frightening. Something that would become central to how Vikings thought about the North, about magic, about the spirit world. Because you see, while the Norse respected Sami skills as hunters and trackers, while they valued trade relationships with them, while they even intermarried with them, there was something else about the Sami that filled Norse hearts with a mixture of awe and terror. The Sami had a reputation that would be recorded in saga after saga. whispered about in Norse halls, feared and desired in equal measure. They were believed to be the most powerful magicians in the world, and the stories about what they could do, well, those stories would shape Norse mythology itself, and eventually echo down through centuries to influence the very legends we tell at Christmas. There's something you need to understand about the medieval Norse worldview. They believed in magic, not in the vague, I believe in the magic of love kind of way. They believed magic was real, practical, and dangerous. They had their own magical practitioners, the cedar workers, the Völvers who could see the future. But even the Norse, with all their own mystical traditions, looked at the Sami and thought, those people are on another level entirely. In saga after saga, chronicle after chronicle, the message was consistent. If you want real power, if you need magic that actually works, you go to the Sami. But you'd better be prepared for what you might encounter. Let me tell you a story that was written down in the Heimskringla, one of the most important collections of Norse sagas, compiled in the 13th century by Snorri Sturluson. It's about a woman named Gunhilda, and it reveals everything about how the Norse viewed Sami magic. Gunhilda wasn't Sami. She was Norse, possibly of royal blood. But as a young woman, she travelled north into Sami territory, which, by the way, was considered incredibly dangerous, because she wanted to learn real magic. Not the respectable kind practiced in Norse society, but the deep, primal, dangerous kind that could bend reality itself. She found what she was looking for: 2 Sami wizards, brothers, living in the wilderness, and these men agreed to teach her. Now, the saga doesn't tell us exactly what she learned or how long she studied with them, but it does tell us what happened next, and it's dark. Fair warning. According to the saga, Gunhilda eventually encountered 2 Norsemen who were travelling through the region. She persuaded these men that the 2 Sami wizards were dangerous, so dangerous they needed to be killed. And here's the detail that's chilling. The saga says these wizards were capable of turning the earth upside down and killing with a look. Now, whether that's literal or metaphorical, we don't know. But the 2 Norse men, convinced by Gunhilda, killed the wizards. And what did Gunhilda do after her teachers were dead? She took all their magical knowledge for herself, went on to marry Eric Bloodaxe, one of the most notorious Viking kings, and became known as one of the most powerful and feared magic users in Norse history. The saga portrays her as manipulative and dangerous, using her Sami-learned magic for political power. But here's what fascinates me. The story assumes, without question, that the Sami wizards really could do these things, that their power was real, that learning from them would genuinely grant someone extraordinary abilities. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever wanted to learn something so badly that you'd travel to dangerous places, study with people your society considered frightening, maybe even cross moral lines to obtain that knowledge? Gunhilda's story is extreme, obviously, but the desire at its core is very human. But Gunhilda's tale is just one story. For a more detailed look at what Sami magic actually looked like, at least from a Norse perspective, we have to turn to a Latin text written in the 12th century, known simply as the History of Norway. Now, this text was written by a Christian, probably a monk, who was deeply disturbed by what he was describing. He calls the Sami ungodly and describes their practices as devilish and unholy. But despite his horror, or maybe because of it, he provides one of the most detailed accounts we have of a Sami shamanic ritual, and it's absolutely fascinating. According to this text, a group of Norse people were present, probably as guests or traders, when a Sami wizard, called a Noadian Sami, decided to perform a ceremony. the Noidi spread out a cloth and prepared himself for what the text calls unholy magic incantations. Then, with his hands extended, he lifted up a small vessel, something like a sieve or a shallow drum, and this vessel, this drum, was decorated. The text specifically mentions images on it: whales, reindeer with harness, little skis, even a miniature boat with oars. Every important element of Arctic life was represented on this sacred object. The Noidi began to dance, not just swaying or moving rhythmically, but really dancing, intensely, for a long time. The text says he was trying to endow this equipment with magic power. Basically, he was using the dance and the drum to activate something, to create a connection between the physical representations on the drum and their real-world counterparts. And then, and this is where it gets really interesting, the Noidi collapsed, just fell to the ground, apparently unconscious, and according to the text, his spirit, his Gandus, left his body and began to travel. Now let's pause here because Gandus is a crucial concept. This wasn't just imagination or meditation. The Norse witnesses believed that the Noidi's spirit actually left his physical body and went traveling in spiritual form, using the images on the drum as vehicles. If he needed to travel over water, his Gandus would take the form of the whale. Over land, the reindeer with harness. Over snow, the skis. This was serious spirit travel, shamanic journey work of the kind that shows up in indigenous traditions around the world. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. While the Noidi's Gandus was traveling, taking the form of a whale swimming through a lake, it encountered another Gandus, another spirit, and this other spirit was hostile. It took the form of sharpened stakes hidden in the depths of the lake, and as the whale spirit swam past, these stakes pierced its belly. And in that moment, back in the physical world, the Noidi, who was lying unconscious on the ground, began to show wounds. Real, physical wounds appearing on his body, matching the injuries his spirit form had received. The Norse witnesses watched in horror as the man died, killed by an attack that happened in the spirit world. The text presents this as evidence that the Noidi was practicing evil magic and got what he deserved. But if you strip away the Christian judgment, what you're seeing is a description of shamanic warfare, the idea that skilled practitioners could battle each other in the spirit realm, and that those battles had real-world consequences. Can you imagine witnessing something like that? You're sitting in a dwelling somewhere in the Arctic. Maybe you're there to trade, maybe you're a guest. Someone starts performing what you assume is just an interesting cultural ritual, and then this person collapses, and minutes or hours later, actual wounds start appearing on their body, and they die in front of you. No physical attack, no visible cause, just dead, with injuries that you saw appear out of nothing. Whether you believe it was real magic or some combination of psychology, suggestion, and possibly even self-harm, the effect on the witnesses was the same. Absolute conviction that the Sami could do things that defied natural law. And those drums, those decorated drums the Noidi used, we've actually found some. They're incredibly rare because Christian missionaries spent centuries destroying them, but a few survived, and they're exactly as described. Oval or circular frames covered with reindeer hide, painted with figures, reindeer, boats, skis, the sun, figures that might represent gods or spirits. Some have brass rings attached that would jingle when the drum was struck. These weren't just musical instruments. They were maps of reality, physical reality and spiritual reality overlapping. Each image was a doorway, a vehicle, a tool for navigation in other realms, and the Noidi who used them trained for years, sometimes decades, to master their use. The Norse had nothing quite like this. Yes, they had their own magic, the Seder practiced mostly by women, rune magic, various forms of divination. But Sami magic was different. It felt more primal, more connected to the land itself, more powerful. And this created a fascinating paradox in Norse society. On one hand, Norse law in early medieval Norway explicitly forbade believing in the Sami or practicing their kind of magic. There were actual legal codes that said, essentially, don't mess with that stuff, don't believe in it, definitely don't practice it. The Christian Church, which was gradually converting Scandinavia, absolutely condemned Sami spiritual practices as demonic. But on the other hand, people wanted what the Sami had. They wanted that power, they wanted those skills. So you get stories like Gunhildr's, where a Norse person secretly travels to learn Sami magic. You get accounts of Norse chieftains consulting with Sami Noidi for advice, for weather magic, for help with hunting or fishing or warfare. It's the classic forbidden fruit situation, isn't it? Society tells you something is evil and dangerous, but also incredibly powerful and effective. What do? Some people obey the rules and stay away. Others can't resist the temptation. This ambivalence, this mix of fear, condemnation, and desire, tells us something important about cultural encounters. The Norse couldn't simply dismiss the Sami as primitive or backward, because the Sami clearly had knowledge and abilities the Norse didn't, but they also couldn't fully embrace or integrate Sami practices without threatening their own cultural and religious identity, especially as Christianity took hold. So instead, the Sami became legendary. They became the wizards of the north, the mysterious magicians who lived beyond the edge of civilization, who could control the weather, who could kill with a curse, who could travel in spirit form, who could see the future and the past. And these legends had staying power. Even centuries later, even after the Sami had been officially Christianized in the 18th century, people still whispered about their magic. Travelers to the north returned with stories. Locals spoke of old families who still kept the drums hidden, who still knew the old ways. But here's where the story takes a tragic turn, because that reputation for magic, which had once inspired awe and a certain wariness respect, eventually became a death sentence. In the 17th century, during the height of European witch hunt hysteria, Finnmark, the northernmost region of Norway where many Sami lived, became the site of some of the most intense witch trials in Scandinavian history. The very remoteness that had once protected Sami spiritual practices now made them seem suspicious. The very knowledge that had once been sought after now became evidence of demonic pacts. People were accused, tried, tortured, and executed. And disproportionately, these people were Sami, or were accused of having learned Sami magic. The drums were destroyed, the practitioners were killed. Centuries of spiritual tradition were violently suppressed in the name of Christian purity. It's one of those historical ironies that breaks your heart. For thousands of years, the Sami had maintained their spiritual practices, had coexisted with their Norse neighbours, even when those neighbours feared and misunderstood them. They'd survived political pressure, cultural change, economic exploitation, but they couldn't survive the witch hunts, at least not openly. The old practices went underground, became secret, became fragments, and yet something survived. Because even as Sami shamanic practices were being destroyed, even as the drums were burned and the Noidi were silenced, the influence of Sami beliefs was already woven into Norse mythology in ways that couldn't be erased. The Norse had learned from their northern neighbours. They'd absorbed ideas, incorporated practices, adapted beliefs. And some of these adaptations had to do with the very animals we've been talking about. The reindeer, Yes, but also the other sacred creatures that moved through Norse mythology. Animals that weren't just animals, but vessels of power, companions of gods, symbols of forces beyond human control. In Norse mythology, the gods didn't walk everywhere. That would be undignified. No, the gods travelled in style, and by style I mean they had some of the strangest, most wonderful vehicles and companions you've ever heard of. We're talking about flying goats, magical horses with 8 legs, and a boar whose bristles literally glowed in the dark. And these weren't just cool mythological details. They tell us something profound about how both the Norse and the Sami understood the relationship between humans, animals, and the divine. Let's start with Thor, because honestly, where else would you start? Thor, the god of thunder, protector of humanity, hammer-wielding defender against giants. You'd expect him to ride something impressive, right? Maybe a fierce warhorse or a dragon, or at the very least a really big wolf? Nope. Thor's chariot was pulled by 2 goats. I know. Goats seem almost comical compared to, say, dragons, but these weren't ordinary goats. Their names were Tangrisnir, which means teeth-bearer or snarler, and Tangjosta, teeth-grinder. And according to the Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, these goats could run through the air faster than any horse could run on land. When Thor rode across the sky in his goat-drawn chariot, the rumbling of their hooves and the grinding of their teeth created thunder. But here's the really wild part, and this is directly from the Norse sources. Thor could slaughter his goats, cook them, and eat them for dinner. And then, the next morning, as long as he carefully preserved all the bones and hides, he could resurrect them with his hammer Mjolnir, and they'd be perfectly fine, ready to pull his chariot again. It's the ultimate sustainable food source, right? Imagine having a self-resurrecting goat. You'd never go hungry. There's actually a story in the myths about Thor sharing a meal with a human family, and their teenage son trying to get at the marrow breaks one of the goat bones. The next morning, when Thor resurrects the goats, one of them is limping. Thor is absolutely furious. You do not mess with the god of thunder's magic goats. And the family has to give him their 2 children as servants to make up for it. Harsh, but it shows how serious the bone preservation thing was. Now, why goats? That's the interesting question. Goats were practical animals in Scandinavia. They could survive on rough terrain. They provided milk and meat and hides. But they were also associated with vitality, stubbornness, strength. They were survivors. And Thor, as the protector of common people, would naturally be associated with an animal that common people relied on. But there's another theory that's really intriguing. Some scholars think the goat symbolism might have connections to Sami spiritual traditions, where certain animals were seen as mediators between worlds, capable of carrying spirits or humans between the earthly and divine realms. The idea of animals as vehicles for spiritual travel, remember those images on the Noaidi drums, wasn't unique to the Sami, but their version was particularly powerful and might have influenced Norse beliefs. Now let's talk about Freyr, one of the most important gods in Norse religion. Freyr was the god of fertility, prosperity, peace, and good harvests, everything that makes life worth living, basically, and his sacred animal was a boar. This boar had a name, Gullinbursti, which literally means golden bristles, and according to the myths, this creature was created by 2 dwarf brothers, the same ones who made Thor's hammer. Gullinbursti wasn't just golden in colour, its bristles actually glowed with light, bright enough to illuminate the darkest night. The boar could run faster than any horse, could run through air and water, and its light could guide Freyr anywhere he needed to go. The boar symbolism is fascinating because boars were genuinely terrifying animals in medieval Scandinavia. We think of pigs as farm animals, right? Pink, round, kind of dopey. But wild boars were dangerous, tusked, aggressive, powerful. Hunting boar was a test of courage. And yet, boars were also associated with fertility because, well, pigs have a lot of piglets. So Freya's boar embodied both danger and abundance, wildness and prosperity. And here's where it connects to our story. During Yule, the midwinter festival, it was traditional to sacrifice a boar to Freya. This was serious business. The saga of Herva and Heidrek, written in the 13th century, describes how important oaths, life-changing promises, were sworn while touching a boar that was about to be sacrificed. The boar would be paraded around the hall, people would place their hands on its bristles, and they'd swear oaths that were absolutely binding. Why a boar specifically? Because you were swearing on Freya's sacred animal, making your oath in the presence of the god of fertility and prosperity. Breaking such an oath wasn't just dishonourable, it was sacrilege, and many Norse sagas revolve around tragic consequences of oaths sworn on Yule boars. This tradition survived in a weird, wonderful way. Even today, in Sweden and other parts of Scandinavia, you'll see straw goats as Christmas decorations. They're called julbok, Yule goats. Now, you might be thinking, wait, didn't you just say the sacred animal was a boar? Here's where it gets interesting. Over time, the traditions blended. Thor's goats, Freya's boar, the last sheaf of grain from the harvest, all of these got mixed together into the folk tradition of the Yule goat. In some versions of the tradition, the Yule goat was a spirit who helped prepare the feast and delivered gifts. Sound familiar? Before Santa had reindeer, Scandinavian children were told that a goat figure brought their presents. The connections between ancient pagan animal symbolism and modern Christmas traditions run deeper than most people realize. But we haven't talked about the most famous animal in Norse mythology yet, the one that connects most directly to our modern Christmas imagery. The one whose story is so bizarre, so completely wild, that when I first read it, I had to double-check that I'd understood correctly. I'm talking about Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse. Where do I even begin with this? Okay, let me just tell you the story straight from the Prose Edda, and you tell me if this isn't one of the strangest myths you've ever heard. Right at the beginning of time, when the gods had just established Asgard, their divine realm, a stranger came to them with an offer. He was a builder, and he promised to build them an impregnable fortress in just 3 seasons. In exchange, he wanted the goddess Freya, the sun, and the moon. Pretty steep price, right? The gods thought about it and figured, well, there's no way he can actually finish in 3 seasons, so let's agree and see how far he gets. But they added one condition. He had to build it alone, with no help from anyone, just him and his horse. The stranger agreed, and his horse turned out to be exceptional. This horse, named Svadilfari, was incredibly strong. Impossibly strong. It could haul massive boulders, work day and night without tiring. With this horse's help, the builder was making incredible progress. As the deadline approached, the gods realized with horror that he was actually going to finish on time. They panicked. They couldn't give up Freya, the sun and the moon. That would be catastrophic. So they turned to Loki, the trickster god, and basically said, "Fix this. This is the kind of problem you're supposed to solve." And Loki, being Loki, came up with a plan. A really weird plan. He transformed himself into a beautiful mare, a female horse, and when Svadilfari was hauling the last stones to complete the fortress, Lokia's mare appeared and, let's say, distracted him. The stallion Svadilfari abandoned his work and chased after this mysterious mare into the woods. Without his horse, the builder couldn't finish on time. the gods didn't have to pay. The builder, furious, revealed his true form. He was actually a giant, a frost giant, and Thor ended up killing him with his hammer. Problem solved, right? Well, not quite, because Loki had, shall we say, such dealings with Svadilfari. That's the delicate way the saga puts it, that some months later, Loki gave birth to a foal, a grey foal, with 8 legs, and this foal became Sleipnir, the best horse among gods and men, which Odin claimed as his personal mount. I want you to think about this for a second. The king of the Norse gods rides a horse that is, technically, Loki's son, a horse born from one of the most bizarre schemes in all of mythology. And this horse has 8 legs, can fly through the air, can ride to the realm of the dead and back, can travel faster than anything in existence. Have you ever heard a weirder origin story? The implications alone. Loki can change gender, Loki gave birth, the god's greatest magical horse is the product of a con job gone sideways. It's a lot to process. But Sleipnir wasn't just a cool ride for Odin. This 8-legged horse appears again and again in the myths doing crucial work. When Balder, the most beloved of the gods, dies and goes to Hel, the realm of the dead, it's Hermoda riding Sleipnir who makes the journey to try to bring him back. The saga describes Hermoda riding for 9 nights through deep, dark valleys, over rivers and across a bridge guarded by spirits, places where no normal horse could go. Sleipnir could travel between worlds, the world of the living, the world of the dead, the world of the gods. Those 8 legs weren't just for speed. They represented the ability to move through different planes of reality, to cross boundaries that should be uncrossable. Now, here's where things get really interesting for our story. Remember how the Sami could domesticate and train reindeer? Remember how reindeer appeared on those shamanic drums as vehicles for spirit travel? The Norse had similar concepts, but they projected them onto different animals, goats, boars, and especially horses. And when the great shift happened in Sami culture, when hunting wild reindeer gradually gave way to herding domestic ones, around the 16th century, it wasn't just a practical change, it was spiritual and cultural too. The reindeer went from being wild, mysterious animals you followed to being partners you lived with, worked with, depended on in a new way. This transformation happened slowly, over generations. It was driven partly by those taxation pressures we talked about earlier. Wild reindeer populations declining, the need to have more reliable access to the animals. But it also represented a philosophical shift. Instead of moving with wild herds according to ancient patterns, Sami herders began to shape those patterns, to manage the herds, to develop even deeper knowledge of individual animals. And you know what's beautiful? Despite all the changes, despite Christianization and political pressure, and cultural disruption, the Sami maintained that core relationship with reindeer. Today, only about 10% of Sami people are actively involved in reindeer herding, but it remains a powerful symbol of identity, a link to ancestors, a practice protected by law in some regions. Those reindeer, the ones that appeared in 10,000-year-old petroglyphs, the ones that sustained people through impossible winters, the ones that carried shamanic spirits to other worlds, the ones that inspired Norse artists and storytellers, they're still there, still moving across the tundra, still central to Sami culture, still carrying the weight of thousands of years of story and meaning. And that's what these sacred animals represent, really. Whether we're talking about Thor's goats or Freya's boar, or Odin's 8-legged horse or the Sami's reindeer, they're all expressing the same fundamental truth, that humans and animals are bound together, that we need each other, that the boundary between the mundane and the magical runs right through the heart of the natural world. The animals in Norse and Sami traditions weren't symbols in the abstract sense. They were real creatures with spiritual significance. They were partners, vehicles, sacrifices, teachers. They were the bridge between earth and sky, between human and divine, between the practical need for food and clothing and the spiritual need for meaning and connection. So when we see reindeer pulling Santa's sleigh, when we see Yule goats decorating Swedish homes, when we roast a ham at Christmas dinner, we're participating in traditions that go back thousands of years to a time when the line between animal and spirit was thin, when gods rode through the sky on creatures that embodied both wildness and divinity. But we haven't yet reached the moment when all these elements, the reindeer, the sacred animals, the dark winter, the need for light, came together into the festival that would eventually become Christmas. We haven't yet stepped into the deepest, darkest, most magical night of the Norse year, when the gods themselves drew close to the mortal world, when fires were lit and oaths were sworn and the turning of the wheel brought both terror and hope. Imagine standing outside on a December night in northern Norway around the year 900. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but you wouldn't know it. The sun made a brief, reluctant appearance just above the horizon an hour ago, more of a dim glow than actual daylight. And now it's gone again. The darkness is so thick, so complete, that you can feel it pressing against your skin. The cold isn't just cold. It's a living thing that finds every gap in your furs, every exposed bit of skin. Your breath crystallizes in the air, and the silence is absolute except for the crunch of snow under your boots. This is the time the Norse called the Wolf's Month, the darkest, coldest part of winter, when the sun seems to have abandoned the world entirely. And this is when they held Yule. Now here's something fascinating that most people don't know. Yule didn't have a fixed date. We're so used to December 25th being Christmas, right? It's printed on calendars, scheduled months in advance, absolutely predictable. But Yule was wild and organic and tied to the sky itself. The word Yule, or Jol in Old Norse, is ancient. So ancient that linguists aren't entirely sure where it came from. One theory is that it derives from Jol, meaning wheel, specifically the wheel of the year turning through its lowest point. Another theory suggests it might come from one of Odin's many names, Mjolnir, which would make it literally Odin's time. Either way, the word predates Christianity in Scandinavia by centuries. But when exactly was Yule? That's where it gets interesting. The Norse didn't use the calendar we use. They track time by the moon, by the position of stars, by the behavior of animals and the feel of the weather. According to various sagas and historical records, Yule happened sometime around the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, but the exact start date varied by region and year. Some sources say it began at the first full moon after the winter solstice. Others suggest it started when the sun was at its lowest point. The saga of Håkon the Good, written about events in the 10th century, mentions that King Håkon, who was Christian but ruled over mostly pagan subjects, tried to standardize Yule to coincide with Christmas, which tells us that before his time, the date was flexible. This flexibility wasn't random or careless. Think about what winter in the Arctic is like. You can't just pick a date months in advance and hope the weather cooperates. You have to read the signs, watch the sky, feel the patterns. When the time was right, when the stars aligned and the moon was full and the darkness was deepest, that's when Yule began. And how long did it last? Well, that varied too. The number we always hear is 12 days, the famous 12 days of Yule that later became the 12 days of Christmas. But the saga of Håkon the Good also mentions that some celebrations lasted only 3 days, or as long as the ale lasted. which honestly might be the most Viking way to measure a festival. How long does Yule last? Until we run out of beer. Can you imagine planning a major holiday that way? When's Christmas? Whenever feels right, and it'll last until we're done partying. It must have driven the Christian missionaries absolutely crazy trying to bring order to this beautifully chaotic tradition. But whether it lasted 3 days or 12, Yule always began with something special: Mother's Night. In Old Norse it was called Modra Night, and it was arguably the most sacred part of the entire celebration. Mother's Night honoured Frigga, Odin's wife, the goddess of wisdom, foresight and motherhood, and the Disir, who were female ancestral spirits, protective spirits of the family and clan. This wasn't just symbolic. The Norse believed that during this longest night of the year, the boundaries between worlds grew thin. The dead could visit the living, spirits could move more freely, and most importantly, the fate of the coming year was being woven. In Norse belief, fate wasn't predetermined by distant, uncaring gods. It was actively woven by female figures, the Norns, who sat at the base of the world tree, and the Disir, who watched over family lines. Mother's Night was when these weavers were especially active and when human women who had passed on might return to check on their descendants. Think about that for a moment. You're sitting in a longhouse, fire burning in the central hearth, your entire extended family gathered close. Outside, the darkness is absolute. Inside, shadows dance on the walls, and you believe, really believe, that your grandmother who died last winter might be present, watching, listening, judging whether you've honoured her memory, whether you've taken good care of the family she left behind. It would be terrifying and comforting in equal measure, wouldn't it? Knowing that you're never truly alone, that your ancestors are present, but also knowing that they're watching, that they have expectations. And there was a ritual that happened on Mother's Night that shows just how seriously the Norse took this boundary-thinning business. They held a vigil, a watch through the night from dusk until dawn. People would stay awake, tending the fire, keeping watch, making sure that the sun would return. Now I know what you might be thinking. They knew the sun would come back, right? This wasn't like they actually thought staying awake would make the sun rise. And intellectually, yes, they knew. They'd seen this happen every year of their lives. But knowledge and faith are different things. This was about participating in the turning of the wheel, about showing the cosmos that humanity was paying attention, that we cared about light returning. It's like when you know, logically, that flipping a light switch will turn on the light, but you still feel a moment of relief when it actually happens, especially if you've been in darkness for a while. The Norse vigil was that moment of relief stretched across an entire night, communal and sacred and necessary. During this vigil, people would tell stories. This was crucial. Remember, the Norse had no written literature at this point. Everything was oral tradition. Mother's Night was when the old tales were repeated, when children learned the myths, when the deeds of ancestors were remembered aloud. If you didn't speak about the dead, they might be forgotten. If you didn't retell the stories of the gods, the knowledge might be lost. So picture it. You're 13 years old, sitting in a smoky longhouse, trying to stay awake through the longest night of the year. An old aunt is telling the story of how Thor fished up the Midgard serpent, acting out the dramatic parts, making the children gasp. Your father is drinking mead and recounting the time your grandfather fought off raiders. Your mother is singing a song her mother taught her, hour after hour, story after story, weaving the past into the present, keeping the ancestors alive through memory. And then finally, after what feels like an eternity of darkness, the first hint of dawn appears. The sky in the east goes from black to deep blue to pale grey, and when the sun finally crests the horizon, even if it's just for an hour, even if it barely clears the mountains, everyone cheers. The vigil is over. The sun has returned. The wheel has turned. Life continues. There was a belief, recorded in several sources, that during Yule, the gods themselves were closer to Midgard, the world of humans, than at any other time of year. The Norse sometimes called the gods Yule beings because they were especially present during this season. Odin walked the earth. Thor's thunder could be heard even in winter. Freya's blessings of fertility extended even to the frozen ground, promising spring would come. This closeness was both wonderful and dangerous. Having gods nearby meant your prayers might be heard more clearly, your offerings might be more effective. But it also meant you needed to be on your best behaviour. The gods weren't distant, uncaring forces. They were right there, watching, judging, occasionally interfering. And it wasn't just gods who walked during Yule. This was also when the wild hunt rode, Odin leading his procession of spirits and dead warriors across the night sky. We'll talk more about that later, but for now, just understand. Yule was when the normal rules of reality got fuzzy. Dead ancestors visited, gods drew near, spirits roamed freely. The dark, cold world became charged with supernatural presence. This is why there were so many prohibitions during Yule. In many communities, no work was supposed to be done. No spinning, no weaving. You didn't want to mess with the Norns' work. No travelling unless absolutely necessary. You didn't want to encounter the wild hunt. No starting feuds or conflicts. This was sacred time, temporarily outside the normal flow of violence and revenge that characterized so much of Norse society. It was a pause, a breath, a moment when the entire community agreed to stop, to gather, to honour the darkness before welcoming back the light. You know what strikes me most about Yule? It's the honesty of it. The Norse didn't pretend winter wasn't terrifying. They didn't minimize the darkness or the cold or the very real possibility of starvation. Instead, they met it head-on with fire and family and faith. They said, yes, this is scary. Yes, we might not all survive until spring, but we're going to feast tonight anyway. We're going to tell stories and honour our dead and drink until we fall over, because we're alive right now, and that's worth celebrating. There's something deeply human about that, isn't there? Not denying the hard things, but choosing joy anyway. Choosing community anyway. Choosing to light fires against the darkness and believe, really believe, that the light will return. And Yule wasn't just one night of vigil and hope. Once Mother's Night was over, the real celebrating began. Because if you've just survived the longest night of the year, if you've kept watch until dawn, if the gods are near and the ancestors are present, you don't just go back to normal life. You mark the occasion. You do something that will echo through the rest of the winter, that will sustain you through the cold months ahead. What did they do? Well, that involved fire and blood and some of the most intense rituals in all of Norse paganism. That involved sacrifices that would horrify modern sensibilities, but made perfect sense in a world where gods demanded payment, where blood was the currency of the sacred, where the line between life and death was constantly negotiated through ceremony. The night after Mother's Night had a name that doesn't mince words. They called it Slaughter Night, and yes, it was exactly what it sounds like. But before you picture chaos and violence, let me paint you the real picture. Because the blot ceremony was one of the most sacred, carefully orchestrated rituals in Norse paganism, and understanding it helps us understand everything about how these people related to their gods, their community, and the natural world. The word blot itself is fascinating. It comes from an Old Norse word meaning to strengthen or to worship through sacrifice. But in practice it meant much more than that. A blot was a communal sacrifice and feast, a way of giving to the gods so they might give back to you protection, prosperity, good harvests, victory in battle. It was a transaction, yes, but a sacred one, carried out with elaborate ritual and deep reverence. Now, I'm going to be honest with you about what happened during a winter blot, because the sources are pretty explicit. This isn't going to be gruesome. I'm not interested in shock value. But it was a blood ritual, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. According to multiple sagas and historical accounts, including early Christian chronicles that were horrified but detailed, here's what happened. The community would select animals for sacrifice. These weren't random animals or sick ones they wanted to get rid of. These were valuable, healthy animals. Horses, cattle, boars, sometimes goats. Giving up a horse in the Viking Age was a significant economic sacrifice. Horses were wealth, status, transportation. Killing one for the gods meant something. The animals would be led to a sacred space. Sometimes this was inside the main hall of a wealthy chieftain. Sometimes it was outdoors at a specific holy site. The slaughter itself was done quickly and skillfully. These were farmers and hunters who knew how to kill animals humanely. The goal wasn't suffering, it was offering. But here's where the ritual gets intense, and where those Christian chroniclers clutch their pearls. The blood of the sacrificed animals was collected carefully in bowls, special vessels kept specifically for this purpose, and then, using what the sources call hlaut-teen, literally blood twigs or sacred twigs, the blood was sprinkled everywhere, on the wooden statues of the gods that stood in the hall, on the walls of the building, on the altars or sacred stones, and on the people themselves. The participants in the ceremony would stand as the blood was sprinkled over them, marking them as part of the sacrifice, as witnesses, as people who had made an offering and now stood under divine attention. Does this sound bizarre to modern sensibilities? Absolutely. Standing still while someone flicks animal blood on you with a twig? That's not most people's idea of a good time, but think about what it meant to them. Blood was life itself. When you shed blood, you were giving life back to the forces that created life. You were saying, we take from the world, animals for food, land for farming, wood for building, and now we give back. We acknowledge that we're part of a larger system, that we owe debts, that the gods deserve honour. There's a Latin text from a Christian observer, and you can practically hear the horror in his voice, that describes these rituals as indecent and bloody beyond measure. He talks about how the walls would be red with blood, how the statues would be dripping, how the people seemed unbothered by being spattered head to toe. But from the Norse perspective, this wasn't indecent. This was holy. This was powerful. This was the moment when the boundary between human and divine became permeable, when your offering was acknowledged, when you could speak to the gods with confidence because you'd paid the price of their attention. And after the blood ritual, then came the feast. Because those sacrificed animals didn't go to waste. The gods took the blood and the spirit of the offering, but the meat belonged to the community. The carcasses would be butchered, cooked over the central hearth fire and shared among everyone present. Imagine the scene. You're in a great hall, fire roaring in the central pit, shadows dancing on the blood-marked walls. The smell of roasting meat fills the air, and I mean fills it. If you've ever been near a pig roast or a whole animal being cooked over fire, you know that smell is overwhelming, primal, makes your mouth water even if you've just eaten. That smell would have permeated everything, your clothes, your hair, your very skin, marking you as someone who had participated in sacred community. and as the meat cooked, the drinking began. This wasn't casual drinking. This was ritual drinking with very specific toasts in a very specific order. The first toast, and this is recorded in multiple sources, including the saga of Håkon the Good, was to Odin for victory and power. Everyone would raise their horns or cups, someone would make the toast, and everyone would drink together. In that moment, you were aligned with Odin, asking for his gifts, acknowledging his supremacy. The second toast was to Njordr and Freyr, gods of the sea, weather and fertility, for peace and a good season. Because what good is victory in battle if your crops fail? What good is power if winter starves you? The Norse were practical people. They wanted success, sure, but they also wanted to survive and prosper. And then came toasts to the ancestors, the men and women buried in mounds, the dead relatives who had shaped the family, the heroes whose stories were still told, to grandfather who cleared this land, to Aunt Astrid who never backed down from anything, to the warriors who fell at such and such battle. Each person remembered, acknowledged, connected to the living through the act of drinking together. Can you imagine how powerful that would feel? You're slightly drunk, or more than slightly, because the sources suggest people consumed about 4 gallons of ale over 3 days, which is a lot. You're full of fresh meat. You're surrounded by your entire community, blood on your skin from the sacrifice, and you're speaking the names of your dead, telling them you remember, telling them their legacy continues. This is where I need to tell you about the oaths, because the oath swearing that happened during Yule blots was serious business. I'm talking life-altering, saga-defining, sometimes catastrophic business. There was a specific ritual for this. A boar, remember sacred to Freyr, would be brought forward. This was often the same boar that would be sacrificed, but before it was killed, people would place their hands on its bristles and swear oaths. The saga of Hervor and Heidrek describes one such oath, a man swearing he would marry a particular woman. The Poetic Edda includes a poem called The Lay of Helgi Jurvardsson, where a man named Heithin, influenced by a curse, swears on the sacred boar that he'll win the love of his brother's girlfriend. Spoiler alert, this does not end well. The oath causes a terrible conflict, people die, tragedy ensues, but the oath, once sworn on the Yule boar, could not be broken. That's the thing about oaths sworn during blot. They were witnessed by the gods. You weren't just making a promise to people, you were making a promise in the presence of divine powers, with blood on your hands and meat in your belly and your community watching. Breaking such an oath wasn't just dishonourable, it was sacrilege. It was inviting the wrath of gods and the contempt of ancestors. Think about how different that is from modern promises. We make commitments all the time, right? New Year's resolutions, promises to friends, work commitments. And sure, we try to keep them, but if we don't, life goes on. Nobody dies. The gods don't punish us. But in Norse society, an oath was a binding supernatural contract. Your word, once given in sacred space, became part of the fabric of fate itself. Now, here's something interesting that shows how different communities within Norse culture could be. The treatment of horse meat. In some regions, eating horse meat during the blot was not just acceptable but required. The horse was sacred to Odin. Some sources even suggest it was sacrificed specifically to him, and eating its meat was participating in divine power. But in other regions, or as Christianity began to influence Norse culture, horse meat became taboo. The saga of Håkon the Good tells a fascinating story about this. King Håkon, who was Christian, attended a Yule blot thrown by his pagan subjects, because a king had to participate in community rituals, even if he personally followed a different religion. The pagan leaders insisted he eat some of the sacrificed horse meat. Haakon refused. They threatened him. He compromised by placing a linen cloth over the pot of boiling horse meat and inhaling some of the steam. Can you imagine the tension in that room? A Christian king trying to navigate pagan ritual, powerful chieftains watching him, testing whether he respects their traditions, the whole political stability of the region potentially depending on whether he'll eat this meat. In the end, the steam compromise satisfied nobody, but prevented open conflict. This story reveals something important. By the 10th century, when Christianity was beginning to spread through Scandinavia, these rituals were becoming contested. What had been normal, sacred practice was suddenly pagan and ungodly. The blot ceremonies continued for a while, secretly in some places, openly in regions where Christianity hadn't yet taken hold, but they were under pressure. Early Christian laws in Norway specifically banned blot ceremonies. Archaeological evidence suggests that in some areas, people continued performing them anyway, just more quietly. Some converted the rituals, keeping the feast and the community gathering but removing the blood sacrifice. Others abandoned them entirely under threat of punishment. And that's tragic in a way, because however strange the blood rituals seem to us now, they served genuine psychological and social functions. They created community cohesion. They gave people a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. We made the offering. The gods will hear us. We've done what we can. They marked time, created meaning, connected past and present. When Christianity banned these practices, it didn't just ban strange foreign rituals. It severed people from traditions their ancestors had practiced for thousands of years. It broke the line of continuity that connected them to their grandparents and great-grandparents, stretching back into the mists of time. But here's the thing about human traditions. They're stubborn. They adapt. They hide. They transform, but survive. The blot ceremonies might have disappeared, but the feast remained. The blood sacrifice ended, but the communal meal continued. The sacred oaths sworn on boughs became, well, they became the promises we make at Christmas dinner, the resolutions we declare at New Year's. Less binding, perhaps, but echoing something older. And that sense of the gods being near, of the boundaries between worlds growing thin, of this being a time when something supernatural was happening, that stayed too. It just got repackaged, reinterpreted, woven into new stories. Because even as the blot ceremonies were ending, even as Christianity was spreading, there was one aspect of Yule that proved impossible to suppress, one tradition so deeply rooted in Norse belief that it survived everything thrown at it. The most terrifying, most thrilling, most powerful image of the Yule season, Odin leading the wild hunt across the winter sky, riding his 8-legged horse, followed by a host of the dead, sweeping across the night in a spectacle that still echoes in our Christmas traditions today. On certain nights during Yule, if you were foolish or desperate enough to be outside after dark, you might hear it first. Not see it, hear it. A sound like thunder rolling across the sky, but wrong somehow. Not the clean crack of summer lightning, but something deeper, more resonant, more filled with voices. Hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, howling and singing and crying out in languages both familiar and utterly alien. And if you heard that sound, every instinct you possessed would scream the same message. Get inside. Bar the door. Don't look up. This was the Wild Hunt, or as it was called in Norway, the Oscarrea, which literally translates to terrifying ride. And at its head, leading this spectral procession across the winter sky, was Odin himself. Now we've talked about Odin as the All-Father, the god of wisdom and war, but during Yule he took on a specific identity, a specific role that was central to the entire season. One of his many names, and Odin had dozens, was Yolnir, literally Master of Yule or the Yule figure. This wasn't just a title. It meant that Odin was the embodiment of the season itself, the divine force behind all the darkness and magic and danger and promise of midwinter. Picture Odin as he appeared in Norse imagination during the Wild Hunt. Not the wise, one-eyed wanderer you might see depicted in peaceful times. No, this was Odin in his most terrifying aspect. A figure wrapped in a long cloak. Sources usually describe it as either blue-grey or dark, that billowed and swirled like storm clouds. A wide-brimmed hat pulled low, shadowing his face, though occasionally you might catch a glimpse of that single eye burning with cold fire, his long beard whipping in supernatural winds as he rode Sleipnir across the night sky. And Sleipnir, remember that 8-legged horse we talked about? This is where it truly lived up to its mythological reputation. Because while Sleipnir could run on land, its real power was moving through the air itself, through clouds, through spaces between worlds. The sources describe the sound of its hooves as like thunder, each of those 8 legs pounding against the sky, creating a rhythm that shook the earth below. But Odin didn't ride alone. Oh no! Behind him came his retinue, and this is where the Wild Hunt gets really interesting and really frightening. First came the Valkyries, those warrior maidens who chose the slain in battle. But these weren't the noble, beautiful figures you see in Wagner operas or Marvel movies. In the original Norse conception, especially during the Wild Hunt, the Valkyries were terrifying, shrieking, fierce, riding their own supernatural horses, their armour gleaming with an otherworldly light. They were death made female, choice made weapon. Behind the Valkyries came the Einarjar, the honoured dead, warriors who had died bravely and been taken to Valhalla. But during the Wild Hunt they weren't feasting peacefully in Odin's hall. They were riding, weapons in hand, reliving their battles, screaming their war cries into the winter night. And then came the others, the dishonoured dead, the people who had died badly, in accidents, or of disease, or who had lived immoral lives, spirits who couldn't find rest, who were caught between worlds, swept up in Odin's procession and forced to ride with him night after night. Some sources suggest that if you were outside when the hunt passed and you witnessed it, you might be swept up too, snatched from the earth and forced to join the ghostly cavalry, riding until, well, no one was quite sure what happened then. Maybe forever. Have you ever been outside during a winter storm, a real one, where the wind is howling and the snow is flying sideways and you can barely see 3 feet in front of you? There's a moment where the world feels actively hostile, where nature isn't just indifferent but almost malicious. The Norse believed that on certain Yule nights, that feeling was the Wild Hunt passing overhead, and they weren't entirely wrong to hide from it. The folklore around the Wild Hunt is incredibly detailed and remarkably consistent across Scandinavia. People reported hearing hounds baying, Odin's hunting dogs joining the procession. They heard horns blowing, the kind of hunting horns nobles would use, but amplified, echoing, wrong. They heard horses neighing and warriors shouting, and sometimes, most terrifying of all, they heard voices calling their names. If you heard your name called from the Wild Hunt, you absolutely did not answer. You did not look up. You did not acknowledge it in any way. Because to respond was to accept an invitation, and once you accepted, you were part of the hunt. There are folk tales of people who were foolish or brave or drunk enough to look up when they heard their name, and according to the stories they were either found dead the next morning or they vanished entirely, presumably swept up into the spectral cavalcade. Now, this all sounds pretty terrifying, right? The wild hunt was nightmare fuel for Norse children, and adults, honestly. Parents would tell their kids, "You need to be inside before dark during Yule, or the wild hunt might take you." It was the original better watch out warning, centuries before Santa Claus made that phrase famous. But here's where things get really fascinating. Because alongside this terror there was also hope, possibility, the chance for blessing. See, Odin in his Yolnir aspect wasn't just collecting souls and terrifying mortals, he was also observing. The wild hunt would pass over villages and farms, and Odin would look down at the people below, the ones smart enough to stay inside, the ones who had made proper offerings, the ones who were keeping the sacred time appropriately. And he would judge them, not in a harsh, punishing way necessarily, more like evaluation. Are these people honouring the gods? Are they taking care of their families? Are they living well? And for those who passed muster, who showed proper respect and lived honourably, there was the possibility of reward. This is where one of the most charming Norse traditions comes in, and it's directly connected to modern Christmas customs in a way that will blow your mind. In ancient Germanic and Norse cultures, children would do something specific on the night they knew the wild hunt might pass. They'd take their boots, their everyday shoes, probably made of leather, worn from use, and they'd stuff them with hay, carrots, or sugar. Then they'd place these boots by the hearth, near the chimney or door. Why? For Sleipnir. Think about it from a child's perspective. The wild hunt is terrifying, yes, but Odin's horse would need to eat, right? It's riding all night across the sky, covering impossible distances, carrying a god on its back. That's hard work for even a magical horse. So maybe, just maybe, if you left out food for Sleipnir, Odin would notice your kindness. Maybe he'd appreciate that you thought of his mount. Maybe, in return for this small gesture of hospitality to a supernatural being, you'd receive something. And according to the folklore, Odin would indeed notice. He'd see the boots by the hearth, see the food left for his horse, and he'd be pleased. Sleipnir would eat the offering, the food would be gone in the morning, and in its place Odin would leave a gift. Candy, small toys, sometimes coins, tokens of appreciation for kindness shown even in the face of fear. Do you see it? Do you see what this became? Children leaving footwear out with food inside, a magical figure on a flying steed visiting in the night, gifts left in exchange for the offering. This is the prototype of Christmas stockings. This is the root of leaving out cookies for Santa and carrots for his reindeer. The parallels are so specific, so direct, that they can't be coincidence. Somehow, over centuries, the terrifying figure of Odin leading the wild hunt transformed into the jolly figure of Santa Claus delivering presents. The 8-legged horse became 8 flying reindeer. The boots stuffed with food became stockings hung by the chimney. The terror became wonder. How did that transformation happen? Gradually, over many centuries, through a complex mixing of traditions. As Christianity spread through Northern Europe, the Church couldn't simply erase Odin. He was too deeply embedded in cultural memory. So instead, his story got softened, reinterpreted, merged with other figures. St. Nicholas of Myra, a real 4th century bishop from what's now Turkey, known for his generosity, provided the gift-giver aspect and eventually the name. Dutch traditions of Sinterklaas, where a kindly old man in robes rode across rooftops on a white horse delivering gifts, kept some of the Odin imagery but made it child-friendly. German traditions of Father Christmas added the fur-trimmed coat and the association with winter itself. But underneath all those layers you can still see Odin. The long white beard? That's Odin's beard. The ability to know who's been naughty or nice? That's Odin's wisdom and omniscience. The travelling across the sky at night? That's the wild hunt, domesticated and defanged but still recognisably the same. Even the colour scheme, Santa's red and white or sometimes blue and white in older European traditions, echoes descriptions of Odin's cloaks in various sources and those reindeer pulling Santa's sleigh. In areas where reindeer were common, they naturally replaced horses as the vehicle of choice for magical gift-giving. 8 of them, specifically, 1 for each of Sleipnir's legs, transformed from a single impossible creature into a team of magical but recognisable animals. The wild hunt itself hasn't entirely disappeared from folklore, by the way. Even into the 18th and 19th centuries, people in rural Scandinavia reported hearing it. That thunderous sound in the sky on winter nights, the howling and the horn calls and the pounding of hooves. Folklorists collected these accounts, and they're remarkably consistent. People genuinely believed they were hearing something real and supernatural. Was it the wind? Winter storms creating acoustic effects in mountain valleys? Mass hysteria? Shared cultural expectation creating a kind of audio hallucination? Or was it something we've lost the ability to hear, a frequency of reality that modern life has deafened us to? I'm not here to tell you what to believe, but I will say this. On a deep winter night, when the wind is howling and the darkness is complete, when you're alone and the modern world seems very far away, it's not hard to imagine hearing something more than just wind. Something that sounds like hunting horns and hoofbeats. Something that makes you very glad you're inside behind walls and doors with light and warmth around you. The Norse knew that winter was a time when boundaries got thin, when the dead walked, when gods rode the sky, when magic was more real than usual. They knew that darkness wasn't empty. It was full of presences, of powers, of things that noticed humans and sometimes interfered with their lives. And they dealt with this knowledge not by denying it, not by explaining it away, but by creating rituals around it, by leaving offerings, by showing respect, by staying inside when it was wise to stay inside, and by gathering together with family and community when the night was darkest and most dangerous. That wisdom, that understanding that we're not alone in the universe, that there are forces beyond our control, but that we can still find ways to coexist with them, to show respect and receive protection, that's what survived. Even when the specific belief in Odin's wild hunt faded, the core truth remained. Winter is powerful, darkness is real, and humans survive by sticking together and honouring something larger than themselves. But the wild hunt and Odin weren't the only divine presences associated with winter and Yule. The Norse pantheon was rich with gods and goddesses who embodied different aspects of the season, and some of them have been almost forgotten despite being absolutely fascinating. There were deities who lived in the mountains, who skied across frozen landscapes, who embodied the harsh beauty of winter itself. And some of these figures might have connections to the Sami, linking back to those mysterious northern neighbours we talked about earlier. While Odin dominated the Yule sky with his wild hunt, there were other divine figures who owned the winter in different ways, gods and goddesses who didn't just visit the frozen landscape but lived in it, thrived in it, embodied it. And some of these figures are so interesting, so clearly influenced by contact with the Sami, that they give us a window into how cultures blend and borrow and create something new together. Let me introduce you to Skadi, and right away, let's address something fascinating. Skadi is technically not a goddess by birth. She's a giantess, a Jötun, one of the ancient beings who existed before the gods and often opposed them, but she was incorporated into the Norse pantheon through marriage, and became honoured as a goddess of winter, hunting, skiing and mountains. And this incorporation itself tells us something important about Norse religion. It wasn't rigid. It adapted, absorbed, changed. Skardi's story begins with revenge. Her father, a giant named Thiazi, was killed by the gods. It's a long story involving stolen apples of immortality, and Skardi, furious, armed herself for battle and marched up to Asgard, the realm of the gods, ready to take vengeance. Now think about that for a moment. One woman, even a giantess, marching alone to confront the entire pantheon of Norse gods. That takes either incredible courage or monumental rage, probably both. The gods, recognizing that she had legitimate grievances and also that she was genuinely dangerous, decided to negotiate rather than fight. Their offer was this: Skadi could choose a husband from among the gods, but she could only see their feet. She had to choose based on feet alone. Skadi agreed, thinking she'd choose Balder, the most beautiful of the gods, by picking the most beautiful feet. But she chose wrong. The god with the most beautiful feet was Njörður, god of the sea, whose feet were constantly washed by ocean waves and therefore perfect. Can you imagine the disappointment? You're picking a husband. You think you're getting the Norse equivalent of a supermodel, and instead you get the sea god. Not that there's anything wrong with Njörður. He was powerful and wealthy, but he and Skadi were completely incompatible. He loved the coast, the sound of seabirds, the smell of salt water. She loved the mountains, the silence of snow, the howl of wolves. They tried to compromise, spending 9 nights at his place by the sea, then 9 nights at her place in the mountains, but it didn't work. Njörður complained that the wolves kept him awake. Skadi complained that the seagulls disturbed her rest. It's almost comical, right? The god's solution to a potential war was to arrange a marriage, and the marriage was a disaster. But what matters for our story is where Skadi lived and what she did. Her home was in the mountains, specifically in a place called Thrymheim, Thunderhome or Stormhome, and there she hunted. The sources describe her as an expert with bow and arrow, able to track prey through deep snow, travelling on skis that allowed her to move across the winter landscape with supernatural speed. Skis. Let me pause there. Because skiing in Norse mythology is strongly associated with Skadi, and scholars have long noted that this seems to be influenced by Sami culture. The Sami were the ski experts of the north. Remember that line from the sagas we mentioned earlier? They can follow tracks like gods both on thawed ground and on hard frozen snow, and they are so able on skis that nothing can escape them. That description could fit Skadi perfectly, and some scholars theorize that Skadi herself might represent a Sami deity or cultural tradition that was absorbed into Norse mythology. Her association with mountains and wilderness, her skiing ability, her hunting prowess, all of these map more closely to Sami life than to typical Norse life, which was more coastal and agricultural. There's even a linguistic hint. The name Skadi might be related to Scandinavia itself. Some etymologists suggest the root means something like danger or shadow, connecting to the idea of the dangerous shadowy north where the Sami lived. Whether Skadi literally represents a Sami goddess, or is a Norse goddess influenced by Sami imagery, the connection is there. Now Skadi wasn't alone as a winter deity. There was another figure, less famous but equally important, especially during Yule, Ula. Ula, sometimes spelled Ula or Ul, was the god of winter hunting, skiing, archery and single combat. His name possibly means glory or magnificence, and while we don't have as many stories about him as we do about Thor or Odin, what we do know is tantalizing. Ulla was apparently so skilled at skiing that he used a ski as a shield in combat, which is either really impressive or really impractical, depending on how you look at it. He was also associated with oath-taking, and there's evidence that oaths sworn by Yule during winter hunts were considered especially binding. If you were going on a dangerous winter hunting expedition, tracking elk or bear through frozen forests, you might swear by Ulla, asking for his skill and protection. Here's something interesting. Ulla seems to have been more important in regions where winter hunting was crucial for survival. In the deep forests and mountains where people depended on winter game to survive, Yule was a major deity. But in more coastal, agricultural areas, he was more obscure. This suggests his worship was tied to a specific lifestyle, one that, again, overlapped significantly with Sami culture. And then there's the Sami thunder god, Horagales. Now this is where the cultural blending gets really fascinating. Horagales was a deity worshipped by the Sami, a god of thunder and lightning who protected humans from evil spirits and demons. He carried a hammer that he used to strike down malevolent forces. Does that sound familiar? Because it should. The similarities to Thor are unmistakable. Thor, the Norse god of thunder, also carried a hammer, Mjolnir, and also used it to protect humans from evil forces, specifically the Jötnar giants. So who influenced whom? Did the Norse Thor inspire the Sami Horagales? Did a Sami thunder deity influence the Norse conception of Thor? Or did both cultures independently develop similar figures because, well, thunder is powerful and impressive, and humans across cultures tend to personify it as a protective male deity with a weapon? The scholarly consensus is that influence went both ways. The Norse and Sami lived alongside each other for centuries, intermarried, traded, shared stories. Of course, their mythologies would bleed into each other. Horagales might have borrowed the hammer from Thor, while Thor might have borrowed some characteristics from earlier Sami thunder deities. It's not a one-way street. It's a cultural exchange, a conversation conducted over generations. But here's what really matters. Both cultures understood winter not just as a season, but as a power, a presence that demanded respect and skill, and sometimes divine intervention to survive. Winter wasn't just cold weather. It was a force that could kill you, yes, but that also offered beauty and clarity and a different kind of life than summer provided. Think about what it would be like to live in the mountains or deep forests during a Norse winter. The silence is profound. Snow muffles sound, creating this eerie quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat. The cold is sharp and clean, making every breath visible, making you aware of your own living warmth in contrast to the frozen world around you. The landscape is transformed, familiar paths hidden under snow, trees weighted down with ice, everything white and blue and grey. In that environment, hunting isn't just practical, it's spiritual. When you track a deer or an elk through the snow, following its traces for hours, reading the story of its movements in the patterns it leaves behind, you're not just finding food. You're connecting with something primal, something that predates civilization, that links you to your ancestors who survived the same winters, who read the same signs, who felt the same cold. And when you finally make the kill, when you bring down the animal with an arrow or a spear, there's a moment of respect and even grief mixed with the triumph. The Sami understood this deeply. Their bear ceremonies showed how they honoured the animals they killed, acknowledging the life given so they could live. The Norse had similar beliefs, sacrificing animals to the gods partly as a way of acknowledging that all life belongs ultimately to the divine, not to humans. Skadi and Ulla embodied this understanding. They weren't just winter gods in an abstract sense. They represented the skills, the mindset, the spiritual orientation required to thrive during the dark months. Worshipping them wasn't about begging for mercy from winter. It was about asking to be made worthy of winter, to develop the skills and courage and endurance that the season demanded. There's a reason Skadi chose the mountains over the comfortable seacoast life Njörður offered. The mountains were harsh, dangerous, unforgiving, but they were also pure, clear, honest. The winter landscape doesn't lie to you. It doesn't pretend to be safe. It shows you exactly what it is, and if you're skilled and brave enough, you can meet it on its own terms. Can you relate to that at all? Maybe you're not tracking elk through snowy mountains, but have you ever been drawn to difficult things? To challenges that scare you a little but also make you feel more alive? That's the Skadi energy right there. That's choosing the mountains over the easy beach life. And Ulla represented something similar, excellence in difficult conditions. Mastery not in comfortable circumstances, but when things are hard, when failure means death, when you have to be perfect because there's no room for error. Winter hunting wasn't forgiving. You got one shot at that deer, and if you missed, you might go hungry. Your arrow had to be perfect. Your tracking had to be flawless. Your understanding of animal behavior had to be complete. These weren't gods you called on for easy success. These were gods you called on to become worthy of survival. Big difference. Now, as Christianity spread through Scandinavia, many gods were forgotten or absorbed into Christian saints. Odin became somewhat preserved in folk traditions, as we've seen. Thor lasted longer because he was so popular. But gods like Skadi and Yule, they largely faded from mainstream religion. However, they didn't disappear from cultural memory. In regions where winter hunting remained important, people still remembered the old ways. They might not have called it worshipping Ulla anymore, but when a hunter paused before a difficult shot, taking that extra moment to center themselves, to channel their skill, to become worthy of the kill, that was Ulla's legacy. When skiers pushed themselves to master difficult terrain, when mountain dwellers learned to read weather and snow conditions with uncanny accuracy, that was Skadi's influence, even if they didn't know her name. And in Sami culture, which maintained its traditional practices longer than Norse culture did, the spirits of the hunt and the mountains never fully left. They were woven too deeply into the fabric of survival to be erased by outside religion. There's something beautiful about that persistence. Christianity couldn't erase the realities of winter or hunting or mountains, and so the spiritual framework for dealing with those realities had to persist in some form, even if the specific names changed, even if the rituals transformed. The gods of winter, whether you call them Skadi and Ulla, whether you remember them through Sami spirits and practices, or whether you simply carry forward the attitudes and skills they represented, they survived because they were useful, because they mapped onto real needs, real challenges, real aspects of life that didn't go away just because the official religion changed. And maybe that's the lesson here. The traditions that survive aren't necessarily the ones that are officially sanctioned or widely popular. They're the ones that serve a genuine purpose, that help people navigate real challenges, that provide meaning in the face of difficulty. Winter demands respect. Mountains demand skill. Hunting demands patience and precision. These truths don't change whether you're a pagan Norse person in 900 AD, a Sami reindeer herder in 1200 AD, or a modern person facing the challenges of your own particular landscape. The specific forms change. We're not doing blood sacrifices or swearing oaths on sacred boughs anymore, thank goodness. But the underlying human needs remain constant. We need rituals to mark time. We need ways to face darkness and cold. We need traditions that bind us to our ancestors and our communities. We need practices that make the harsh parts of life bearable and even meaningful. And as we move forward in our story, we're about to see how all these elements, the reindeer, the sacred animals, the winter darkness, the gods of sky and mountain, the blood rituals and the hunting traditions, how all of this gradually transformed. How Christianity didn't erase these traditions but rather absorbed them, reinterpreted them, wove them into new patterns that we still recognize today. How a pagan midwinter festival slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly became Christmas. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like one day everyone was performing blood sacrifices and the next day they were singing hymns. Cultural change never works that way. Instead, what happened over several centuries was something far more interesting, far more human. Traditions didn't disappear, they adapted. They found new meanings. They survived by becoming something else while still, somehow, remaining themselves. Let me tell you about the Yule log, because its journey from pagan ritual to Christmas tradition is absolutely fascinating and involves fire, ash, magic, and a surprising amount of practical thinking. In Norse tradition, the Yule log wasn't just firewood, it was the firewood, chosen with incredible care. Families would select a massive log, usually oak, because oak was sacred to Thor and represented strength and endurance. This wasn't a log you could just toss in the fireplace. We're talking about something so large it would take several people to drag it home, something that would burn not for hours but for days. The log would be carved with runes, those angular Norse letters that were believed to have magical properties. Specific runes for protection, for prosperity, for the blessing of the gods. The carving itself was a ritual, done with reverence and intention. You weren't just decorating, you were inscribing your prayers directly onto the wood that would carry them to the gods through fire. And then, on the first night of Yule, remember, that longest night of the year, the log would be lit. The goal was to keep it burning for the entire 12 days of Yule, or at the very least through the darkest days. This fire represented the sun, represented life persisting through the deepest darkness. As long as that log burned, your household had light and warmth and symbolic protection. But here's where it gets really interesting. The ashes and any unburned pieces of the log weren't just discarded. Oh no, they were carefully collected and saved. The ashes would be scattered in fields to ensure good crops in the coming year. Pieces of the charred log would be kept under beds for protection against lightning and fire, because by the logic of sympathetic magic, wood that had been blessed and burned in a sacred fire couldn't be destroyed by ordinary fire. Some families would save a piece of the log specifically to light the next year's Yule log, creating an unbroken chain of sacred fire stretching back through generations. Imagine that. A fire that was, in a sense, thousands of years old, passed down from parent to child, each year's log kindling the next. When Christianity came to Northern Europe, the missionaries looked at this tradition and thought, okay, we can work with this. They didn't ban the Yule log. Instead, they just shifted its meaning slightly. Now you weren't burning the log for Odin or Thor. You were burning it to celebrate Christ's birth, to symbolize the light of Christ entering the world. Same log, same fire, same family gathering around it, new official explanation. And that pattern, that's how most Yule traditions survived. Christianity, especially as it spread through Northern Europe, was remarkably pragmatic. The church understood that you couldn't just rip away traditions that people had practiced for centuries and expect them to be happy about it. So instead, they absorbed those traditions, baptized them, gave them new meanings. Take evergreen plants. holly, ivy, mistletoe. In pre-Christian Norse and Celtic traditions, these were profoundly magical. Think about it from their perspective. Every other plant has died or gone dormant. The trees have lost their leaves, the fields are brown and frozen, everything looks dead. But these plants, they're still green, still alive. In the middle of death and darkness, they persist. That's powerful symbolism. The Norse believed that bringing evergreens into your home during Yule was literally bringing life indoors, maintaining a connection to the vital force of nature even when nature itself seemed dead. It was protection magic. The plant's ability to survive winter would theoretically transfer to your household. Holly was especially significant because of those red berries and sharp leaves. The berries represented vitality, blood, life force. The sharp leaves protected against evil spirits, literally. People believed that malevolent spirits couldn't enter a home decorated with holly because they'd be deterred by those spiky leaves. It's a physical ward, like a supernatural security system made of plants. Ivy was associated with fidelity and eternal life because of how it clings and persists. In some traditions, holly represented masculine energy, aggressive, spiky, bold, while ivy represented feminine energy, clinging, persistent, patient. Bringing both into your home during Yule was about balance, about honouring both aspects of life. And then there's mistletoe. Oh, mistletoe! This plant has one of the darkest origin stories in Norse mythology, and somehow it became the plant under which we kiss at Christmas. Let me tell you that story, because it's wild. Balder was the most beloved of all the gods. Beautiful, kind, wise. Basically the Norse equivalent of a golden retriever who everyone adores. His mother Frigga loved him so much that she went around to every single thing in existence, every plant, every stone, every animal, every element, and made them swear an oath that they wouldn't harm Balder. Everything agreed except one thing, mistletoe. And why? Because Frigga thought mistletoe was too young, too small, too insignificant to bother with. It was just a little parasitic plant growing on trees, harmless, barely noticeable. You can see where this is going, right? Loki, the trickster god, discovered this loophole. He made an arrow out of mistletoe and gave it to Balder's blind brother Hoder during a game where the gods were throwing things at Balder to demonstrate his invulnerability, which honestly sounds like a really weird party game, but gods are strange. Hoder, not knowing the arrow was made of the one thing that could hurt Balder, threw it, and Balder died. The gods were devastated. Frigga wept so hard that her tears turned the mistletoe's white berries red, or in some versions of the story they stayed white, preserved by her grief. When Balder was eventually resurrected, that's a whole other saga, mistletoe became a symbol of love, resurrection, and hope. The plant that caused death became a symbol of life returning, so the tradition developed. Mistletoe, this symbol of resurrection and hope, became a sign of peace and love. If enemies met under mistletoe, they had to call a truce. If friends or lovers met under mistletoe, they would kiss as a sign of goodwill and affection. From tragedy, a tradition of connection. Christianity again looked at this and adapted it. Mistletoe became associated with Christ's resurrection instead of Balder's. The kissing tradition remained, because honestly, people weren't going to give up a tradition that gave them an excuse to kiss. But now it was framed as Christian fellowship rather than pagan peacemaking. Have you ever stopped to think about how weird it is that we bring trees inside our houses in December? Like, if an alien visited Earth and saw this tradition with no context, they'd be so confused. The humans, they cut down trees and bring them into their dwellings and cover them with lights and shiny objects. This is normal? but the tradition makes perfect sense once you understand the pre-Christian context. In many Germanic tribes, there was a belief that spirits lived in trees, not metaphorically, but literally. Trees were homes for supernatural beings. During Yule, when the boundary between worlds was thin, people would bring small evergreen trees inside as a way of housing friendly spirits, giving them shelter from the wild hunt and the harsh winter in exchange for blessings on the household. Trees would be decorated with offerings, fruits, nuts, small handmade items. These weren't just decorations, they were gifts to the tree spirits. Over time, as Christianity spread, the trees stayed, but the explanation changed. Now you weren't housing tree spirits, you were celebrating God's creation, or honouring the tree of knowledge, or representing the cross, depending on which Christian interpretation you heard. The modern Christmas tree tradition, as we know it, became formalised in Germany in the 16th century. Martin Luther supposedly added candles to a tree to represent stars, but its roots, pun intended, go back centuries earlier to these pagan practices, and the decorations, those evolved too. The Yule goat made from straw, remember connected to Thor's goats and Freya's boar, became a Christmas decoration, especially in Sweden where you still see huge straw goats in town squares. Small ornaments, originally offerings to spirits, became simply decorations, beautiful for their own sake. Gift-giving also transformed in interesting ways. In pagan Yule, gifts were exchanged but usually within families, and they were practical: clothing, tools, preserved food. The gifting was about reinforcing family bonds and ensuring everyone had what they needed for winter. But there was also another dimension: gifts to the gods. Remember those sacrifices, those offerings. You gave to the gods, and in return you hoped to receive their favour. It was transactional, yes, but also deeply spiritual. Christianity reframed this through the story of the Magi, the three wise men bringing gifts to baby Jesus. Now gift-giving became about emulating their generosity, about celebrating Christ's birth through acts of giving. The structure remained the same. The theological justification changed. What amazes me is how much of the original meaning survived despite the surface changes. The Yule log is still about light in darkness, even if you're burning it for Christ instead of Odin. Evergreens still represent life persisting through death, even if you frame it through Christian resurrection instead of pagan vitality. Gift-giving still strengthens community bonds and expresses love, whether you're doing it for Jesus or for Thor. The early Christian missionaries, at least the smart ones, understood something profound. You can't erase culture, you can only transform it. When Pope Gregory then sent missionaries to Britain in the late 6th century, he explicitly told them not to destroy pagan temples, but to consecrate them as Christian churches. Don't stop the festivals, just redirect them toward Christian purposes. This wasn't cynical manipulation necessarily, or at least it wasn't only that. It was also a recognition that human beings need rituals, need celebrations, need ways to mark time and create meaning. The missionaries understood that if they took away all the old traditions without offering anything in return, people would resent Christianity. But if they kept the traditions and just shifted their meaning, people could adopt the new religion without losing their cultural identity. Does that make the Christmas traditions less authentic? I don't think so. I think it makes them more human. Every tradition we have is a palimpsest, layers of meaning written over previous layers, with traces of the old still visible through the new. Christmas is simultaneously a celebration of Christ's birth and a midwinter festival honouring the sun's return. It's both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. When you light candles or string up lights during Christmas, you're participating in a tradition that's thousands of years old. humans pushing back the darkness with fire. When you bring evergreens into your home, you're connecting to ancient people who also wanted life and green growing things during the deadest time of year. When you give gifts, you're echoing countless generations who showed love and strengthened bonds through giving. The specific beliefs have changed. Most people aren't worried about the wild hunt anymore, aren't making blood sacrifices, aren't swearing binding oaths on sacred boughs. But the human needs those traditions served, the need for light, for community, for hope in darkness, for celebration in the face of hardship, those haven't changed at all. And all of these transformed traditions, all of these adapted rituals, they eventually combined with another element we haven't fully explored yet, the evolution of the gift-bringer himself. How Odin's terrifying sky ride became Santa's jolly journey. How 8 legs became 8 reindeer. How a god became a saint, became an icon of childhood wonder. That transformation is its own remarkable story, a tale of cultural mixing and creative reimagining that spanned continents and centuries. So here's the million-dollar question. How did a one-eyed Norse god riding an 8-legged horse through terrifying night skies become a jolly fat man in a red suit delivering presents to children? The answer involves a Turkish bishop, Dutch immigrants, American poets, Finnish folklore, and one very clever advertising campaign. It's a story of cultural evolution that's honestly more entertaining than most fiction. Let's start in the 4th century, in a city called Myra, modern-day Turkey, nowhere near Scandinavia. There lived a man named Nicholas, who served as the local bishop. Now, Nicholas wasn't mythical. He was a real person, born around 270 AD, who died around 343 AD. We have historical records of his existence, mentions of him in church documents, accounts of his attendance at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. But what made Nicholas special, what made him a saint, were the stories. Oh, the stories. The most famous one involves a poor man with 3 daughters. In that time and place, daughters needed dowries to get married. Basically, their father had to pay money to prospective husbands, or the daughters couldn't wed and might end up destitute or worse. This particular father was so poor he couldn't afford dowries, and in desperation, he was considering selling his daughters into prostitution. Nicholas heard about this situation and decided to help, but anonymously. He didn't want recognition, he just wanted to help. So one night, he threw a bag of gold coins through the family's window. Some versions say it landed in a stocking that was hanging by the fire to dry. The next night he threw another bag, and the third night the father was waiting, caught Nicholas in the act and tried to thank him. Nicholas reportedly said something like, "Thank God, not me," and left. 3 bags of gold, 3 daughters saved. And suddenly, Nicholas had a reputation as a secret gift giver who helped people in need. There are other stories too. Sailors caught in storms prayed to Nicholas and claimed he appeared to them, calmed the seas, and saved their ships, which is why he became the patron saint of sailors. There's a truly bizarre story about him resurrecting 3 children who had been murdered and pickled in a barrel by an evil innkeeper, which, honestly, medieval hagiography was wild. The point is, Nicholas developed a reputation for miracles, for protecting children, for helping the poor and desperate. When he died, he was buried in Myra. But then, and this is where it gets sketchy, in 1087, a group of Italian merchants from Bari essentially stole his bones. They broke into his tomb, took his remains, and brought them back to Bari, Italy, where they built a huge basilica to house them. Later, Venetians claim they got some of the bones too. So St. Nicholas's remains ended up scattered across Italy, which sounds disrespectful but was actually considered a huge honour. Having a saint's relics could make your city wealthy and important. Nicholas's cult spread throughout medieval Europe. His feast day, December 6th, became associated with gift-giving, especially to children. In many European countries, children would leave out their shoes on the eve of December 6th, and they'd wake up to find small gifts, if they'd been good. Now here's where things get interesting. As Nicholas's legend spread north into Germanic and Scandinavian regions, it encountered the existing folklore about Odin and the wild hunt, and people started noticing similarities. Both figures travelled at night, both flew through the sky, Nicholas on clouds, according to some stories, Odin on Sleipnir. Both knew whether people had been good or bad, Nicholas through divine omniscience, Odin through his ravens and his wisdom. Both left gifts in shoes or stockings. Both had long white beards. The cultural cross-pollination was inevitable. In the Netherlands, Nicholas became Sinterklaas, a kindly old man with a white beard who wore bishop's robes, usually red, by the way, a bishop's colour, and rode across rooftops on a white horse. Not eight-legged, but white, like Sleipnir. He carried a big book listing who'd been naughty or nice, echoing both Christian judgment and Odin's all-seeing wisdom. Sinterklaas was accompanied by helpers. In early traditions, these were sometimes depicted as dark or mischievous figures, possibly echoing the chaotic spirits of the wild hunt. The tradition was that Sinterklaas would visit on the night of December 5th, St. Nicholas Eve, coming down chimneys to leave gifts in shoes that children had left out. Does this sound familiar yet? Because it should. Every element of Santa Claus is already here. The white beard, the red outfit, the flying across rooftops, the knowing who's been good or bad, the chimney entrance, the gifts in footwear, the helpers, the whole package. We just need to transport it across the Atlantic. In the 17th century, Dutch immigrants brought the Sinterklaas tradition to New Amsterdam, which would become New York. The name Sinterklaas was gradually anglicised by English speakers to Santa Claus. But at this point, the tradition was still recognisably Dutch, and still celebrated on December 6th or thereabouts, not December 25th. The transformation into the modern American Santa Claus happened primarily because of two men, a poet and an illustrator. In 1822, a man named Clement Clark Moore, or possibly someone else, there's some debate about authorship, published a poem called A Visit from St. Nicholas, which you probably know as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. This poem was revolutionary in how it shaped the Santa mythology. First, it moved the visit to Christmas Eve, not St. Nicholas Eve, syncing Santa with Christmas itself. Second, it gave us those 8 reindeer, named them, and described them pulling a sleigh, very clearly echoing Sleipnir's 8 legs, but now distributed across 8 separate animals. Third, it described Santa as a right jolly old elf, emphasizing the magical, non-human nature of the figure. Fourth, it established the chimney entry, the filling of stockings, the checking of the list. Can you imagine writing a poem and having it shape global culture for the next 2 centuries? Moore, if it was Moore, essentially codified Santa Claus as we know him. Every movie, every mall Santa, every Christmas special is working from the template this poem established. But what did Santa look like? That's where Thomas Nast comes in. Nast was a political cartoonist who, starting in the 1860s, drew a series of illustrations of Santa Claus for Harper's Weekly magazine. And Nast got incredibly detailed. He drew Santa's workshop. He put it at the North Pole, specifically choosing the most remote magical location possible. A place of endless winter where the old pagan associations with ice and darkness could still lurk. He drew Santa checking his list, reading letters from children, supervising elves in the toy workshop. Wait, elves. Where did the elves come from? Well, remember Alfheim, the realm of the elves in Norse mythology? Odin was the lord of the elves. The connection to supernatural helpers, to otherworldly beings assisting with the work, that's pure Norse influence filtering through centuries of storytelling. Nas Santa was plump, had a full white beard, wore a fur-trimmed suit, sometimes red, sometimes brown or blue. He looked like a mix of a wealthy Victorian gentleman and a medieval Norse figure. He was jolly, yes, but also authoritative. He was watching. He knew if you'd been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake. But the Santa we know today, the specific standardized image, came from one more source: advertising. In 1931, Coca-Cola commissioned an artist named Haddon Sundblom to create paintings of Santa Claus for their Christmas advertising campaign. Sundblom, interestingly, was the son of Finnish immigrants, and he drew on the Finnish Joulupukki tradition, the Yule goat or Yule buck, a figure who was connected to gift-giving and who wore red. Before Sundblom, depictions of Santa varied widely. He might be tall or short, thin or fat, stern or jolly. But Sundblom created a Santa who was consistent, definitely plump, definitely rosy-cheeked, definitely jolly, definitely in a red suit with white fur trim. And because Coca-Cola's advertising was everywhere, Sundblom's Santa became the Santa. It's kind of hilarious, right? One of the most powerful cultural symbols in the world was standardized by a soda company. But that's how culture works. It's not always the most dignified processes that create lasting traditions. So let's trace the lineage. Odin, the one-eyed god riding his 8-legged horse during the wild hunt, leaving gifts in boots. St. Nicholas, the Turkish bishop who gave gold to the poor and protected children. Sinterklaas, the Dutch fusion of Nicholas and Odin riding a white horse across rooftops. Father Christmas, the English personification of holiday cheer. Santa Claus, the American synthesis of all these figures, riding a sleigh pulled by 8 reindeer, living at the North Pole with his elves, checking his list twice, coming down chimneys to fill stockings with gifts. 3 distinct figures, pagan god, Christian saint, and folkloric gift-bringer, merged over centuries into one universally recognized icon. It's like the ultimate crossover event, except it took 1,000 years instead of happening in one movie. And the reindeer? Well, that's the most direct connection to our original story. In regions where reindeer were common, Scandinavia, Finland, Lapland, it made sense that the magical gift-bringer would use the local magical animals, and 8 of them specifically. That's Sleipnir's 8 legs, transformed but still recognizable. There's even a theory that Rudolph, the red-nosed reindeer added in 1939 by Robert May for a Montgomery Ward marketing campaign, echoes old Norse ideas about light in darkness, about a single bright point leading the way through the winter night. Though honestly, Rudolph is probably more about American commercial creativity than ancient mythology. What gets me about this whole evolution is how organic it was. Nobody sat down and planned, okay, we're going to merge Odin with St. Nicholas and create Santa Claus. It happened gradually, naturally, as cultures mixed and stories cross-pollinated. Dutch immigrants brought their traditions to America. American poets reworked those traditions. Illustrators visualized them. Advertisers standardized them. Each generation added something, changed something, adapted the story to their own needs and understanding. And through it all, certain core elements persisted. A magical figure who travels at night during the winter, who rewards good behavior and knows people's deeds, who brings gifts, who's associated with animals, horses, goats, reindeer, who embodies both the terror and the wonder of winter. The scary wild hunt became the jolly Christmas Eve flight. The stern, judgmental All-Father became the warm, forgiving Santa. The blood sacrifices became cookies and milk. The sacred oaths became letters to Santa. The terrifying winter spirits became cheerful elves. Everything got softer, friendlier, more appropriate for children. But is Santa any less magical for being a composite of different traditions? Is Christmas any less meaningful for having pre-Christian roots? I don't think so. If anything, the long evolution makes it more remarkable. We're participating in traditions that are thousands of years old, that have been shaped by countless hands, that connect us to ancestors we'll never know. When a child leaves out cookies for Santa and carrots for the reindeer, they're echoing Norse children leaving food for Sleipnir. When families gather around the Christmas tree, they're connecting to ancient people who brought evergreens inside during the darkest time of year. When we sing about dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh, we're remembering the joy of winter travel despite the cold. The traditions transformed, but they survived. The beliefs changed, but the human needs those beliefs served. The need for hope in darkness, for community in hard times, for magic and wonder in an often harsh world. Those needs are eternal. And now, as we near the end of our journey, we need to ask, what does all of this mean? How do these ancient stories of reindeer and shamans, of wild hunts and winter gods, of sacrifice and celebration, how do they speak to us now, in our modern world so different from the frozen landscapes of ancient Scandinavia? What wisdom can we carry forward from these old stories into our present and future? We've travelled a long way together tonight, 10,000 years, across frozen tundra and dark forests, through blood rituals and sacred fires, from ancient petroglyphs to Coca-Cola advertisements. And now, as our journey comes to a close, I want to bring us back to where all stories ultimately lead, to the present moment, to what this all means for us, here and now. Because here's the thing, the Sami are still here. That's important to understand. They're not a historical curiosity, not a vanished people whose traditions exist only in museums. There are about 100,000 Sami people living today, spread across Norway, Sweden, Finland and Russia's Kola Peninsula, the same lands their ancestors inhabited 10,000 years ago. And yes, some of them still herd reindeer. It's no longer the dominant way of life. Only about 10% of Sami people are actively involved in reindeer herding. But those who do practice it are maintaining a tradition that stretches back millennia. They're using modern technology, sure, snowmobiles and GPS and cell phones. But they're also using knowledge passed down through so many generations that its origin is lost in the mists of time. There's something profound about that continuity. In our modern world, where everything changes so fast, where traditions seem to last maybe 1 or 2 generations before being abandoned or forgotten, the Sami have maintained their connection to reindeer for thousands of years. They've survived plague, warfare, forced Christianization, multiple kingdoms trying to tax and control them, attempts at cultural erasure, and the pressures of modern life. And they're still here, still following the herds, still speaking languages that encode deep knowledge of the Arctic environment. In some Nordic countries, reindeer herding is legally reserved for Sami people. It's recognized as more than just a profession. It's a cultural practice, an identity, a living connection to history. When a young Sami person learns to herd reindeer, they're not just learning a job. They're becoming part of a story that began when their ancestors first followed wild herds across retreating ice sheets. Think about what that means. In a world where most of us are disconnected from where our food comes from, where we've lost track of the seasons, where we can have strawberries in December and pumpkin spice in July, the Sami still live in rhythm with nature. They still move with the animals. They still read weather and snow and animal behavior with skills that took centuries to develop. There's a lesson in that, I think. Not that we all need to go live in the Arctic and herd reindeer. Most of us would die of exposure in about 20 minutes. But that there's value in connection. Connection to place. Connection to tradition. Connection to rhythms older than ourselves. And that brings us back to Christmas, to Yule, to whatever you call this midwinter celebration. Because even if you live in a city, even if you've never seen a reindeer except as a decoration, even if your closest encounter with winter wilderness is shoveling your driveway, you're still participating in something ancient. When you light candles or string up lights in December, you're doing what humans have done for thousands of years, creating light in darkness, refusing to let the long nights win. The specific technology has changed. We've gone from open fires to LED strings, but the impulse is identical to those Norse families keeping the Yule log burning, to those ancient hunters lighting fires against the polar night. When you gather with family, even if the gathering is sometimes awkward or complicated or involves relatives you only tolerate once a year, you're honouring something older than any religion. Humans survive winter by clustering together, by sharing resources and warmth and stories. Your family dinner is echoing those Norse blots, those communal feasts where entire communities gathered, ate together, and reminded themselves that they weren't facing the darkness alone. When you give gifts, you're participating in a tradition that goes back to children leaving food for Sleipnir, to Norse families exchanging practical items to help each other survive, to St. Nicholas dropping gold through windows, to Odin rewarding kindness shown to his horse. The wrapping paper is new, but the act of giving, the expression of care and connection through material generosity, that's ancient. And when children get excited about Santa Claus, about reindeer flying through the sky, about magic happening on the longest night of the year, they're responding to something deep and true. Not the literal truth of a man at the North Pole, though let kids believe what they want to believe for as long as they can, but the deeper truth that winter is magical, that darkness makes light more precious, that there are forces in the world larger than ourselves. The terror of the wild hunt became the wonder of Santa's flight, but both speak to the same reality. We live in a mysterious universe. There are things beyond our control. The seasons turn whether we want them to or not. Winter comes, and we must face it. But we don't face it alone, and we don't face it without resources, both practical resources and spiritual ones. The Sami understood this. The Norse understood this. Every culture that survived winter understood this. You mark the darkest time with light. You mark scarcity with feasting. You mark fear with courage. You transform terror into celebration, not by denying the darkness, but by meeting it with fire and family and faith. Does it matter whether you believe in Odin or Jesus or nothing at all? I don't think so. The traditions work whether or not you subscribe to their original theology, because they're addressing human needs that transcend any specific belief system. We need light. We need community. We need hope. We need rituals that mark time and create meaning. We need to know that after the darkness, light will return. And it always does, doesn't it? The sun always comes back. The days always start getting longer after the solstice. Spring always follows winter. Life persists. The wheel turns. That's not faith. That's observed reality repeated every year since humans have been paying attention. But knowing intellectually that spring will come doesn't make winter easy. You still need something to get you through the dark months. You need traditions that give structure to the waiting. You need celebrations that remind you why survival matters. You need connections to other people who are also waiting, also enduring, also hoping. That's what all of this has been about, really. Not the specific details of Norse mythology, or Sami shamanism, or Christian theology, but the universal human experience of facing darkness and finding ways to create light, of being afraid and finding courage, of being alone and finding community. The reindeer, those animals we started with 10,000 years ago, they're the perfect symbol for all of this. They're wild but can be domesticated. They're northern animals adapted to the harshest conditions. They migrate following ancient routes, teaching us that movement and adaptation are necessary for survival. They provided everything the Sami needed: food, clothing, tools, transportation. They appeared in the first human art in the region, and they appear now on Christmas cards and holiday sweaters. From wild animals carved in stone to magical creatures pulling Santa's sleigh, reindeer have been with us through the entire journey. They're the thread connecting past to present, connecting different cultures, connecting the practical to the magical. And maybe that's the final lesson. The practical and the magical aren't opposites. A reindeer is a real animal with biological needs and behaviors. It's also a spirit vehicle, a symbol of survival, a carrier of gods and gifts. Both things are true. The world contains both mundane reality and profound mystery, and we don't have to choose between them. Your Christmas tree is a real tree, cellulose and chlorophyll, following the biological imperative of evergreens. It's also a symbol of life persisting through death, a vessel for spirits, a representation of something larger than itself. The cookies you leave out are actual food with calories and ingredients. They're also an offering, a gesture of hospitality to the mysterious, an echo of children 10 centuries ago leaving food for a magical horse. This both and thinking, this ability to hold multiple truths at once, that's wisdom. That's what survived from the pre-Christian world into the Christian world and into our modern secular or post-secular world. The specific myths change, but the human capacity for meaning-making, for seeing multiple layers of reality simultaneously, that persists. So what do we carry forward from this long, strange, beautiful history? What do we take from the Sami herders and Norse warriors and Christian missionaries and American poets who all contributed to the traditions we now practice? Maybe we carry forward the courage to face darkness, knowing that light returns, the commitment to community, even when it's hard, the willingness to give, even when resources are scarce, the capacity for wonder, even when we're old and cynical, the respect for nature and its cycles, the understanding that we're part of something larger than ourselves, a chain of humans stretching back thousands of years, all doing their best to survive and find meaning and create beauty in the process. We carry forward the reindeer, in whatever form they take in our lives, the animals or practices or traditions that connect us to something ancient, something true, something that survived because it was useful and meaningful and beautiful, and we carry forward the stories, because stories are how all of this persists. Stories are how the Sami taught their children which patterns in snow meant a reindeer had passed. Stories are how the Norse passed down their myths. Stories are how St. Nicholas became Santa Claus, became the figure that children all over the world recognize. This story we've shared tonight, about reindeer and shamans, about wild hunts and winter gods, about blood and fire and transformation. This is now part of your story too. You'll carry it forward. Maybe you'll tell someone about the Sami and their deep knowledge of reindeer. Maybe you'll think about Odin when you see Christmas lights. Maybe you'll feel differently about mistletoe, knowing about Balder's death and resurrection. Maybe you'll simply have a richer sense of the depth beneath our holiday traditions. And that's how it should be. Every generation receives the stories, adds to them, adapts them, and passes them forward. You're not a passive recipient of tradition. You're an active participant in its ongoing evolution. The story isn't finished. It's still being written. The Sami are still following their reindeer across the tundra. Christmas is still being celebrated, still evolving, still meaning different things to different people. Winter still comes every year, and humans still respond by creating light and gathering together and telling stories. The wheel is still turning, and somewhere tonight, maybe in Norway or Finland, maybe in your own neighbourhood, a child is looking up at the winter sky, hoping to catch a glimpse of something magical. Maybe reindeer, maybe stars, maybe just the mystery of darkness and the promise of light returning. And in that moment of wonder, they're connected to every human who ever looked up at the winter sky with hope and fear and curiosity. They're part of the story that began 10,000 years ago and continues now. So thank you. Thank you for taking this journey with me, for sitting through the darkness and the cold and the blood and the magic. Thank you for following the reindeer with me, from ancient petroglyphs to modern Christmas cards. Thank you for meeting the Sami and the Norse, for witnessing their struggles and celebrations, for seeing how their stories became our stories. I hope you sleep well tonight, wrapped in the warmth of connection to all those humans who faced winter before us. I hope you dream of firelight and flying horses and reindeer moving across snow. I hope you wake up with a deeper appreciation for the traditions you practice, whatever they might be, and I hope you'll come back, because there are so many more stories to tell, so many more connections to explore. History is full of these threads linking past to present, full of surprises and depth and meaning waiting to be discovered. Every tradition you practice has roots you probably don't know about. Every holiday, every custom, every seemingly simple thing is connected to something ancient and profound. So until we meet again, keep the fire burning, keep telling stories, keep looking up at the winter sky with wonder, keep the spirit of Yule alive, whatever you call it, whatever form it takes in your life. The wheel turns, the sun returns, the stories continue, and somewhere reindeer are still walking across the snow, carrying the weight of 10,000 years of human hope and survival and magic on their antlers. Good night, sleep well, and may your dreams be full of light,